And so, I'm sorry, I just realized that I hadn't started the recording, so I'm going to start the recording now. So um, you'll be able to hear or go back to everything I've been saying so far. And I don't think I want to go into all of the details of how scholars would look at research to determine whether it's evidence-based, because I just don't think that the BCAT exam is going to have that level of depth involved in it. So I think at this point, we can just move on to the next area. But I do want to offer anyone who's listening right now a chance to ask any questions about the first page of the BCAT task list, which is the autism spectrum disorder. So these are the first 12 bullet points that I've covered so far today. If there are no questions, I will move on in about 30 seconds, okay? Okay, I don't see any hands being raised, and I don't see any chats coming up on the screen, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next page of the BCAT task list. This is the principles of ABA. So let's just get going. Positive reinforcement. Most of you should know what that is at this point, I hope, but if you don't, I'm going to give you just a few quick examples. So positive reinforcement, the two words in that concept, positive is one and the word reinforcement is another. So in ABA, reinforcement always means that the behavior increases in the future. So reinforcement equals, whoa, take it easy there. Reinforcement equals behavior increases in the future. You know, it's that simple. If you do something as a consequence, and in the future that behavior that was consequated increases, what you did was reinforcement. It doesn't matter if you smiled and the behavior increased, or if you frowned and the behavior increased. If the behavior increased, it was reinforcement. If you told them, great job, and the behavior increased, that's reinforcement. If you told them, bad boy, bad girl, not that you would do that, and the behavior increases, guess what? That's still reinforcement. The term positive means that the consequence was an addition to what the child had. So you added something to the child's repertoire, or you added something, you gave something, you delivered something to the child. So if I gave the child a smile and the behavior increased in the future because I gave the smile to the child, you know, even though it's not tangible, I'm just showing them my face, and the behavior increased, because I gave it, it's positive. Because the behavior increased in the future, it's reinforcement. Put those two together, voila, positive reinforcement. So if everyone who's on a computer right now, could you just throw up in the chat box one example that you'd like of positive reinforcement, so I can see that everyone's kind of more or less on the page? Great, high five. Yeah, that's one example. Obviously, if the behavior increases, you gave them a high five. Sure. Thumbs up, pat on the back, turn in homework on time, get an A+, yep. And then future homework turning on time goes up, great. Well done, Whitney. All right, yeah, so these are all examples of positive reinforcement. And there's millions and millions of examples, right? So this is most commonly for us because we're working with the kid, we're doing praise and things like that, high five. They get access to a cookie, or, okay, they get access to jumping on the trampoline or something like that. There's a number of different things that we can deliver or add to the child, and then assuming the behavior increases, that thing is positive reinforcement. But the interesting thing about positive reinforcement is, because we have to wait to see if the behavior actually does increase in the future, determining that any particular consequence was a positive reinforcer is really a retroactive decision, right? Because let's say you high-five a kid, you know, at 9:50 a.m. on a Saturday, but that behavior that you high-five them for, let's say turning in their homework, you won't see if that behavior increases till Monday. You really don't know until Monday that the behavior increased. And so you cannot determine that that high-five was positive reinforcement until you see the behavior increase at a later date. So the weird thing about positive reinforcement is, even though we talk about, oh, I'm positively reinforcing the kid right now, or, whoa, I gave him a positive reinforcer, you don't really know that until later on when you see that the behavior improved. So if you've been high-fiving the kid and giving him cookies and tickles and pats on the back and praise, but they don't improve in their eye contact, you weren't doing positive reinforcement the whole time, right? Because you have to have that one piece of it, which is the behavior increases. Moving on, negative reinforcement. The same logic applies for negative reinforcement in the second word, the reinforcement, because if the behavior increases in the future, that was reinforcement. Now the question becomes, what does that mean negative? Because in conventional terms, negative almost sounds like a bad thing, right? Like, oh, something negative happened. But in ABA terms, negative isn't really good or bad. In fact, none of these four consequences, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, none of these four consequences are good or bad per se, because all four of them are really there to help the child learn what to do. But in this case of negative reinforcement, negative means the withdrawal of something, the taking away or the subtraction of something. So, and again, don't think that taking away something could be bad, because if I take an Advil when I have a headache and it takes away or subtracts that headache, that is negative reinforcement. I'm more likely to take aspirin the next time I have a headache. So I'm very thankful for it taking away something. And so you shouldn't get confused when you hear about negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement is where something is withdrawn, the consequence is a subtraction of something, and the behavior increases in the future. So I gave you the example of taking an aspirin is my behavior, and the consequence for my behavior of taking the aspirin was it subtracted or took away my headache. So that's one example, and I'm more likely to take aspirin as a result of that next time I have a headache. So my behavior is going to increase in the future. Some other common examples of negative reinforcement would be if the kid says, "Break, please." That's their behavior. And then you take away, their homework, at least so they, for a short time, because they're going to have to finish it eventually. But let's say you give them a break for 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Well, that's a subtraction of the work for 2 or 3 minutes. And it makes their future frequency of asking, "Break, please," more likely. So that would be another example of negative reinforcement. Can you guys throw up some examples on the chat box of other examples of negative reinforcement? All right, so Melissa, 10 trials instead of 15. Yeah, so let's say the kid, asks for a break, or maybe because they, if they're nonverbal, they hand you a break card and you shorten it by 5 trials, right? Speeding ticket reduces speeding in the future. So Whitney, if it reduces speeding in the future, that can't be negative reinforcement, because reinforcement always increases behavior in the future. So a speeding ticket would be a subtraction of money, of course. So there you got the negative part correct, but because that ticket, the subtraction of money out of your bank account, reduces your speeding behavior in the future, that's actually a negative punisher, not a negative reinforcer. Rochelle, completing chores successfully one day and taking a day off chores away later. Yeah, so if the kid does their chores on Monday through Thursday, maybe they get a free day from having to do chores on Friday. Good. Paula, kiddo's hand being dirty and having them wash them. So what's the reinforcer there, Paula, in the case of when they wash their hands? So washing hands subtracts the dirt, and so they're more likely to wash their hands in the future, it sounds like, is your logic? And if that is, you are correct. Yeah, you're more likely to wash your hands because the dirt was removed. And you could probably say that about a lot of things. Washing your body, washing your hair, right? I guess I'll brush my teeth today, things like that. All right, good. Whitney, oh yes, very good. Perfect, thank you guys. All right, good. A few of my favorite examples of negative reinforcement is when your alarm goes off in the morning, for those of you who use an alarm clock. When the alarm is buzzing, that's really annoying. And so most of us either hit snooze or we just turn the alarm off, which takes away or subtracts the annoying buzzing noise or the annoying beeping noise. So in the future, we're more likely to hit snooze or hit off when the beeping is going on. Some of us have those seatbelt alarms on our car where if we don't buckle our seatbelt, the car makes a buzzing noise or something like that. And so when that happens, we buckle the seatbelt, that's our behavior, and it reduces or takes away the annoying beeping or buzzing noise, which of course makes us more likely to buckle our seatbelt in the future. So just a couple of examples. And by the way, you can negatively reinforce problem behaviors too, right? So let's say a kid is given broccoli, and the parent says, eat your broccoli, and the kid begins crying or whining or saying, I don't want broccoli, I hate broccoli, it's gross. And after some bargaining, the parent takes away the broccoli. Well, what does that teach the kid? It reinforces by taking away the thing they didn't like. It reinforces their complaining or their bargaining behavior or their tantruming behavior. And so in the future, when a non-preferred food is presented, the kid is more likely to tantrum or bargain because last time they did it or the last 10 times they did it, it resulted in the subtraction of the non-preferred food. So inadvertent reinforcement also occurs, and that would be another example of negative reinforcement. So I feel like we have a good idea of negative reinforcement. We're going to move on. Number 3, positive punishment. So this is where something is delivered or added, hence the term positive. And of course, the result on the behavior is that in the future, the behavior decreases. So the word punishment in ABA terms, or in the ABA world, punishment means the behavior decreased in the future, or was less likely in the future. And again, just like reinforcement, you have to have the data to determine that. So, for example, when I was a kid, if I cussed, my mom or dad would whack me on the butt with the wooden spatula, or maybe wash my mouth out with soap. Both of those consequences were a delivery of a consequence. Either the whack on the butt was a delivery of pain, and the bar of soap in your mouth was a delivery of a bad flavor, basically. And as a result of those consequences being delivered, my future frequency of cussing decreased. So delivery of consequence, positive. Future frequency of behavior decreases, therefore punishment. Put those together, positive punishment. Now, we're not going to be washing kids' mouth out with soap or whacking them on the butt with a spatula. We'll just save that for the Italian families. But we may add work. So if the kid hits, they may have to do an extra math problem. That would be the addition of extra effort to hopefully decrease the future frequency of hitting. So the addition of extra math homework or math problems, positive, and the future frequency of hitting decreases, punishment. Put that together, positive punishment. So if I could have some people throw out a few examples on the chat box of positive punishment, just so I can see that we're all alive. All right, great, Whitney. So you have another interesting way of saying it. Now your argument is correct, but you said it in just slightly an off way. So you said yelling at my husband for leaving his clothes on the floor increases putting his clothes in the hamper. So again, when you're talking in terms of positive punishment, you want to be thinking about what behavior decreased. So in this case, yelling at your husband is definitely an addition, a delivery of a consequence. But the behavior that decreases in the future is leaving the clothes on the floor. We don't need to go into where he ends up putting the clothes. He could put them, in his sock drawer for all we care. But in the case of punishment, we're talking about the decrease of the behavior. So what happens is when you yell at your husband, and good for you, you show him who's boss. When you yell at your husband and he is less likely to leave clothes on the floor, then that was a delivery of a positive punisher. Another one, Paula. Kiddo takes their sibling's toy without asking, having them go to timeout Okay, so let's see if that makes them less likely. So assuming it makes the kiddo less likely to steal their sibling's toy, going to timeout is probably considered a negative punisher, and here's why. When you go to timeout, a timeout is basically a removal of access to all the fun stuff that is normally in the time-in environment. So assuming that the timeout environment is void of all these fun things like toys and social attention and TV and iPad, timeout is really a subtraction or a taking away of access of all those fun things, and so most people consider timeout actually as a negative punisher. But it's kind of hard because everyone says, oh, we're giving the child a timeout, we're putting him on timeout. And so the word give, like give him a timeout, seems to tell us, oh, it must be a delivery of a timeout. It must be a positive punisher. And so that one's a little tricky, so I can understand how that one would be confusing. But generally speaking, so you guys know, a giving of a timeout, and I'm putting the word giving in air quotes, giving of a timeout is generally considered a negative punisher. So, Paula, just keep that, make that note to yourself, and everyone who's listening on this webinar, make sure you note that a timeout, because of what it represents, it's not about what's being given to the child or being delivered to the child that makes a timeout a positive punisher or a negative punisher. It's really the subtraction of the time-in environment. And so it's really important that the time-in environment be very reinforcing. So by contrast, the timeout environment kind of sucks. Melissa, not saying hello, then having the kiddo say hello multiple times. Okay, so this is like an overcorrection technique. Yeah, great example. So the child does a non-response, right? When we don't like non-responses, just like we don't like incorrect responses. So you want to see a future decreasing of non-responses. And so as a result of this particular non-response, you have the child, you overcorrect, and you say, okay, you're going to do positive practice. You're going to make them say hello, 5 or 10 times. And as a result of having to do that extra effort, non-responses in the future are less likely. And this kind of relates to something that Whitney had said is, you could almost assume that, well, if non-responses decreases in the future, that has to be replaced by something. So it must also increase responses of saying hello, just like Whitney's husband increased putting the clothes in the hamper. And you have to recognize that it's a little bit detailed, but you have to recognize that when you're talking about positive punishment, in this case, the overcorrection, or in Whitney's example, the yelling at her husband, the positive punishment procedure only is affecting the problem behavior in this case, the leaving the clothes on the floor or the non-response. You have to look at a different consequence that's actually responsible for your husband putting the clothes in the hamper. Some reinforcing consequence is responsible for Whitney's husband putting the clothes in the hamper. That's not obviously the yelling. And something is going to also be responsible for the kiddo saying hello when someone says hi to him. And that, whatever that consequence is, has to be discovered. Now, maybe in the case of Whitney's husband, the reinforcer that is responsible for him putting the clothes in the hamper is because he avoids having to be yelled at, right? The avoidance of pain is a reinforcer. Or the avoidance of having to do extra trials, like of saying hello 5 or 10 times, the avoidance of that extra effort is a reinforcer. And so by avoiding the extra effort or being yelled at, that reinforces the appropriate behavior, the replacement behavior. Rochelle says, what about a child taking a toy from a sibling and having the child give the toy back to the sibling? Would that be considered positive reinforcement? Okay, so let's look at that. That's a good question. So the child steals the toy from the sibling, and the consequence is the child has to give the toy back to the sibling. To me, if I was looking at that, so first of all, we want to know if you're saying, would that be positive reinforcement? Well, if the behavior of stealing the toy increases, then it might be positive reinforcement. But I think what you meant to say there is, would that be considered positive punishment? So let's assume we don't want the child to be stealing his sibling's toy anymore, and so as a consequence, we decide to have the child give the toy back. To me, I would say that that is a removal or a subtraction of a desirable item. You know, the toy is probably a fun item. And so even though he only had the toy for a few seconds maybe, you know, depending on how on top of the kid the parent was or the staff was, that would be a removal of or a subtraction of the toy because he stole it, right? So the kid steals the toy, we make the kid give the toy back to the sibling, that's a subtraction of the toy, and as a result, stealing the sibling's toy goes down. So that would be subtraction, the word negative then applies, behavior of stealing goes down in the future, the word punishment applies, therefore I would look at that and call that a negative punishment. You know, that's my logic. So I'm just kind of walking you through how I think about it. Perhaps you could add an additional consequence like scolding the child. You know, let's say, oh, that's not very nice. Why? Now, assuming the kid doesn't want scolding, because some kids like getting scolded, right? But let's assume this kid doesn't like being scolded. You know, you could say, hey, that's not nice. You stole your brother's toy or your sister's toy. Give it back to them. So now there's really two consequences happening. You've got the negative punishment, the giving back of the toy or the subtraction of the toy, and you've got a positive punisher in the form of the scolding, right? And so think about like Whitney, I think it was, gave the example of getting a speeding ticket a while back. So think about what a speeding ticket does. There's a lot of things going on there. You've got, of course, the subtraction of money from your bank account, right? And if it makes speeding decrease, you know, you're less likely to speed in the future, you then put those two together. Okay, subtraction of money, the term negative applies. Behavior of speeding decreases in the future, the term punishment applies. Put those together, you have negative punishment. But think about this. When you get pulled over for speeding, there's also kind of there's a delivery of, you know, guilt or embarrassment, right? The cop comes up to you and says, you know how fast you were going? You know why I pulled you over? That's the cop voice, of course. You know, there may be an addition of embarrassed feelings or guilty feelings. And certainly, by the way, if you're speeding fast enough, you might get points added to your driving record, which will, of course, you know, that'll have other, you know, negative consequences for you. But adding points to your driving record could be considered a positive punishment because of the addition of points. Just as when the police officer pulls you over, it's an addition of feelings of embarrassment or guilt or something like that. All of those could be considered the addition of a consequence, you know, the addition of guilt, the addition of points on your record. And then if your behavior of speeding goes down, that consequence would be considered then a positive punishment. So really, if you get pulled over for speeding and you get points added to your record and you lose money out of your bank account, you have both negative punishment and positive punishment occurring. That would be decreasing the future frequency of your behavior. So it's really, it's of course fascinating from a behavior analytic point of view to really look at real life situations and start to analyze what's really going on here. I don't know if the BCAT exam is going to be that detailed. I think you should have a general knowledge of if the consequence is added and the behavior increases, it's positive reinforcement. If the consequence was subtracted and the behavior decreases, excuse me, and the behavior increases, it's negative reinforcement. If the consequence was added and the behavior decreases, it's positive punishment. And of course, number 4, if the consequence was subtracted and the behavior decreases, it's negative punishment. So you can really look at it that way and try to keep it that simple in your head. You know, write that down. If the consequence was added and the behavior increases, positive reinforcement. Consequence was subtracted, behavior increases, negative reinforcement. Consequence was added, behavior decreases, positive punishment, and if the consequence was subtracted and the behavior decreases, negative punishment. It's really that simple when it comes down to it. You don't really have to get into too much whether the child likes it or the child doesn't like it, because sometimes you think the kid's not going to like it, but the behavior increases. I mentioned scolding as, a situation where some kids actually, you think scolding would be a punisher, but if the behavior increases, guess what? Scolding was a reinforcer. It would be most likely a positive reinforcer, right? If if a child steals his sibling's toy and the parent scolds the child and makes the child give the toy back, but stealing toys increases in the future, guess what? That wasn't a punisher. That was a reinforcer. So you really need to be able to think about it in these kind of concrete terms and, mull over it. Ask your colleagues and your supervisors questions in the next week if you're not sure about it. But really, you want to get a good idea of, what are positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. All right. So unless there's additional questions about those first four, and actually, really, that's the first six, because numbers 5 and 6 on the this page is just generally speaking reinforcer, and just generally speaking punisher, which we've already covered what a reinforcer is and what a punisher is. It's a consequence that increases behavior or a consequence that decreases behavior. So unless there's additional questions on those, I'm going to move on to number 7 and 8. Conditioned reinforcer and unconditioned reinforcer. So just scroll up a little bit. Let's start with actually number 8. Number 8 is an unconditioned reinforcer. An unconditioned reinforcer is something that will increase future frequency of behavior. That's obviously the word reinforcer. But the word unconditioned means it didn't have to be learned for it to have that power to increase behavior. So a lot of reinforcers are, I'm going to say, from an evolutionary biological need, are going to be reinforcers for the a human being. So food is an unconditioned reinforcer. No one had to teach us that food, if delivered as a consequence, assuming the food is desirable, but that food, because it's a biological need, is an unconditioned reinforcer. Water or drink is an unconditioned reinforcer. You need it for survival. Shelter, warmth is an unconditioned reinforcer. You need them for survival. Sexual stimulation is an unconditioned reinforcer. You need them for the survival of the species. Kind of just think of anything you need to survive, that's an unconditioned reinforcer. In contrast, conditioned reinforcers are things that you had to learn are actually, reinforcing consequences. So you had to learn that these things called dollar bills are reinforcers. And now, of course, by the time you get a certain age, everyone knows that dollar bills are reinforcers. But it wasn't until those dollar bills were able to be exchanged for things that you need, like shelter and food and water, and maybe not, but maybe sex, I don't know, that dollar bills were learned, oh, this is something that I want to get, and if I get them, it'll increase the behavior that follows that. So if I work 40 hours a week and I get these things called dollars in my bank account, I'm more likely to work 40 hours a week in the future. For the kiddos that we work with, we use tokens, right? Or praise. Praise is a conditioned reinforcer. A praise saying "good job." It's really there's really nothing in and of the words "good job" that's reinforcing. You don't need the words "good job" to survive. But because "good job" has been associated or conditioned with other reinforcers, like acceptance into a social group. If your parent say "good job, I'm proud of you," that is associated with protection from being part of that family unit. If the teacher says "good job" or you got an A on your exam, an A is another example of a conditioned reinforcer. That those reinforcers are associated with social acceptance, and of course, along with social acceptance comes a lot of other good aspects like social protection and things like that. So those are all examples of conditioned reinforcers. Or if we use a token system with a kid, and the kid earns a token for doing chores or for sharing with their sibling or something like that. Tokens are conditioned reinforcers. You don't need them to survive, but it's because those things like good job, an A on the paper, or a token, or a dollar bill have all been associated with other reinforcers that they have over time acquired reinforcing properties. That is, initially they were neutral, but by virtue of being paired with other reinforcers, they acquire the ability to strengthen behavior. So that's the difference between a conditioned reinforcer and an unconditioned reinforcer. Kind of just to say it very briefly, and then we'll move on. An unconditioned reinforcer did not have to be paired with anything else to teach us that this will strengthen a behavior. Whereas, in contrast, a conditioned reinforcer was initially neutral, but by virtue of it being paired with other reinforcers, we learned that this is something that's valuable and that this thing will strengthen behavior in the future. And so that's the difference between a conditioned and an unconditioned reinforcer. And if the BCAT exam is giving certain examples of types of reinforcers and asking whether they're conditioned or unconditioned, just try to think of, if you need it to survive, food, water, sex, shelter, social protection, warmth. Those types of things are unconditioned reinforcers. If they're things like praise, high fives, a letter grade like an A, or tokens or dollar bills, those are conditioned reinforcers. Because in an evolutionary sense, those other things didn't really have any value. They're just paper, right? If there's no questions, I'm going to move on to the next one, extinction. Okay, so let me just do a time check real quick. It's about 10:15. All right, I think we're doing all right. Extinction. So the textbook definition of extinction is basically, once you know what the reinforcer is that's maintaining a behavior, you eliminate that reinforcer. So let's say a kiddo, and the four functions of behavior is what comes into play here, right? You have the four functions are generally attention seeking, escape or avoidance. That's number 2. Number 3, access to like tangible items or activities. And number 4 is generally called self-stimulatory behavior or automatic reinforcement. So depending on what the function of any particular behavior is, extinction means not giving that reinforcer. So, it's eliminating a reinforcer that previously was maintaining the problem behavior or the behavior, because you can put even good behaviors on extinction on accident if you aren't watching what you're doing. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Let's start with like some problem behaviors. That's a little bit easier to wrap our head around. So let's say the kiddo, is nagging his mom, pulling on her clothes or something, and we do an ABC analysis, and it, seems pretty clear that the kid's doing this for attention-seeking purposes. So we conclude that the function of nagging mom is to get attention. So now we know what the functional reinforcer is. We're familiar with that attention, or getting attention, or specifically getting mom's attention, is the functional reinforcer that's maintaining the nagging. Mom says, what, and gets the attention. So then extinction in that sense means, well, we have to not have mom give that attention. We have to teach mom what to do, to withhold giving that attention. And of course, that's easier said than done. But in theory, that's what extinction would be if, this is a big if, like in all caps, if the function is attention. Ignoring the kid or withholding giving attention is only extinction if the function is getting mom's attention. If it's not getting mom's attention, then ignoring, or sometimes we call it planned ignoring, is not extinction. And that's a common mistake that people make. People think that, oh, I'm going to put them on extinction by doing ignoring. No, that's only extinction if the function is, and the functional reinforcer is, attention. Of course, there's 3 other functions of behavior that we have to consider. And in those other functions, planned ignoring would not be extinction. So let's look at the next one. Let's say it's escape or avoidance. So this is where the functional reinforcer is getting out of a demand or getting the removal of a non-preferred demand or a non-preferred item or a non-preferred activity, like your math homework or Brussels sprouts or something like that. And so in this case, not allowing the reinforcer to be delivered, in this case, really it's not the delivery, it's actually the removal of the aversive task. Extinction would mean to follow through, right? So in this case, if it's an aversive task the kid's trying to escape or avoid, well, extinction means don't let them avoid it. Don't let them escape it. That means the parent has to follow through with, or the staff has to follow through with that task. The parent says, no, you're going to eat your Brussels sprouts, or no, you're going to clean your room, something like that. So in the case of an an escape behavior, extinction isn't ignoring. In fact, ignoring would be the worst thing you could do, because then the kid's like, okay, perfect, ignore me, right? Because then I'm not going to do the work. I'm not going to clean my room. Just keep going on and ignoring me. Extinction would be following through. Let's look at the third function of behavior, access to tangibles or activities. In this case, the functional reinforcer that's maintaining the problem behavior is the kid usually ends up getting access to it. I'll paint you an example. So the kid says, I want a cookie. And the mom or dad says, no, you've had enough, no more cookies. And the kid starts whining or saying, I want a cookie, or maybe goes into a full-blown tantrum, I don't know. And the mom says, or the dad says, fine, but this is the last one, I mean it. Right? Yeah, I mean it. So in that case, the tantrum and the whining and the bargaining, those problem behaviors, ended up getting access to the cookie. And by the way, sometimes that will happen in a chain of behaviors. For example, the kid starts whining, and then the parent says, no, I'm not going to give you a cookie while you're whining. Ask in a nice voice. And then the kid goes back to his little angel voice and says, I want a cookie, please. And now the parent gives it to them because the parent feels like, oh, I'm reinforcing the nice asking. But the only reason you allowed them to even have that option is because they tantrumed. So it just creates a chain where the kid ends up being denied access, tantrums, parent prompts the kid to ask nicely, the kid asks nicely, and then the kid gets the cookie anyway. It's still the same problem. So in these cases, extinction would be, no, you're not getting the cookie. That's it. You engage in the problem behavior, you're past the point of no return. Sorry, my hands are tied. I can't give you the cookie now. And so extinction in this case means continuing to withhold or continuing to deny access to that reinforcer. In the fourth function, and this is really the hardest one to talk about, self-stimulatory behavior. This is where the behavior, like hand flapping or maybe rocking back and forth, the behavior produces the reinforcer automatically. That's why sometimes it's called automatic reinforcement. And this one's really tricky because how do you prevent the reinforcer from being delivered when the behavior in and of itself produces the reinforcer? Hand flapping immediately or automatically produces, whatever that reinforcer is. Let's say it's visual stimulation by seeing their hands move in front of their field of vision. Or rocking their body back and forth automatically produces the reinforcement of that movement feeling. That's, I believe that's a vestibular movement. Cynthia Conway, if she's on this webinar, can correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, that becomes very challenging to how do you put that on extinction if the behavior automatically produces that. So it's like the moment the kid hand flaps, the reinforcement occurs. And there's really there's a few ways you can address that. So is it possible for the child to engage in hand flapping without being able to, see his hands, right? Without being able to get the visual stimulation? Well, unless you're going to cover the kid's eyes with a blindfold or your hands, there's probably not a good way to do it. And covering the kid's eyes doesn't seem like a very pragmatic intervention to use. So you're probably not going to be able to do true extinction with that kind of a behavior. Most of the time we end up just saying, okay, redirect the hand flapping by saying, hands quiet or something like that, so the kid doesn't get to have his hands up and flapping in front of their eyes very long. But technically that's just redirection. That's not extinction. It's not the same thing. Extinction would be if the behavior happened, but the reinforcer is not delivered. So in that example, it means if the hand flapping happened, but the visual stimulation was never perceived by the kid's visual system, which again comes back to that whole, what are you going to blindfold the kid? Maybe a more realistic example of of sensory extinction might be, okay, so like here's an example. So I worked with a kid many years ago who would bite his own hand, and it appeared to be for the pain that it released, like the endorphins that were released when he bit his hand. And so he was, ended up having like this really bad callus on his like upper thumb area. And so after doing the functional analysis, it appeared that the kid was doing it for the sensory stimulation, really the pain or the endorphins that were released when he bit his hand hard. And so the extinction procedure, to do true sensory extinction, we had to allow the behavior of hand biting to occur, but not allow the reinforcer, which in this case was the endorphins or the pain. And so what we did is we actually had the kid wear gloves, and so when he bit his hand, the gloves were pretty thick. I think they were like leather gloves. So he would bite his hand, and as a result of the hand biting, he didn't get that same like kind of sharp pain on his hand, and it didn't release endorphins because the gloves served as a protector from the bite, basically. And so as a result, he was able to bite his hand, but he never got the reinforcer, which were the endorphins that were released. And so that was a true sensory extinction procedure because the behavior occurred, but the reinforcer was denied. Had we just redirected him and said, oh, hands quiet, or take your hand out of your mouth, that wouldn't be true extinction because either A, if it's redirection, the behavior occurred and therefore the reinforcer occurred, or B, even if we response block him, we block him with a physical prompt or a hand-over-hand prompt before he was even able to get his hand in his mouth, that wouldn't be extinction either. That's just response blocking because in order for true extinction to occur, the behavior has to occur. And if we block the behavior from happening in the first place, then the behavior never occurred. So extinction for self-stimulatory behaviors is a very challenging endeavor for us as behavior analysts and as practitioners in the field of autism intervention. So just to kind of summarize extinction, it's removing the reinforcer that previously maintained a behavior. So that's the most general way I can say it. Obviously you have to know what the functional reinforcer is, which means you have to know the function of the behavior. You can accidentally, in fact, it happens all the time, you can accidentally put good behaviors on extinction as well. So think about a couple of examples here. Or actually, no, I'll ask you guys. Can some of you who've been responding, or preferably some of you who haven't been responding yet, give an example of extinguishing a good behavior? All right, so Rochelle, thank you for responding. Replace hand flapping with using a fan, so it's the same motion but more appropriate. So the kid would be getting visual stimulation from the fan moving in their field of vision. Yeah, so Rochelle, what you're talking about here is a great intervention because it serves the same function, but what you're talking about here is differential reinforcement, and we're going to get to that in a moment. I don't see it on the page, but it's probably on the next page. Differential reinforcement is going to be, giving reinforcement for a different behavior. In this case, a replacement behavior is teaching the kid maybe to turn on the fan and then looking up at the fan. And then that would be reinforced by the same visual stimulation. But that's not technically a sensory extinction because for sensory extinction, they would need to, hand flap or something like that and then not see their hands moving. So let me give you an example of a good behavior because I don't see anyone kind of responding to that one. How many times have you seen the kid say, "Excuse me," and the adult doesn't give them attention? Yeah. So think about that. Isn't "excuse me" the desirable behavior, right? We don't want the kid nagging or pulling at the clothing. or doing something even more inappropriate, and let's say the mom's on the phone or the dad's on the phone or something, and the kid says, "Excuse me," and the mom or the dad keep talking on the phone. Well, that's basically withholding attention from an appropriate attention-seeking behavior. "Excuse me" is a very appropriate attention-seeking behavior, and by the parent not giving attention to the "excuse me," they're essentially putting "excuse me" on extinction. So what's the kid going to resort to? Of course, he's going to resort to the thing that used to work, which is nagging. So, let's say, I'm trying to think of another example of extinction. There's probably thousands of them, but from real life. My wife, since we talk about, people's wives yelling at them for doing or not doing certain things, my wife may say, "Hey, Jared, can you please leave the toilet seat down?" Or "Can you put the toilet seat down after you're done using it?" And if I don't put it down, I'm basically withholding access from the thing that she was asking for, manding for appropriately. She was manding appropriately for me to put the toilet seat down, and then when I don't do that, I'm basically putting her mand on extinction, her request on extinction. And so she may be like Whitney and start yelling, of course, and then I'll probably get the picture, but at least for her appropriate mands, I'm putting those on extinction. All right, let's move on to number 10, deprivation. Actually, we're going to go with deprivation and satiation, numbers 10 and 11. So deprivation, it has to do with what's called an establishing operation, or EO for short. Establishing operation. An EO. An establishing operation establishes motivation, right? An EO establishes motivation to do a certain behavior. So if I'm deprived of cookies, then a cookie is going to be very motivating to me because I'm going to really want to get a cookie. In contrast, satiation is what's called an abolishing operation, or AO for short. And an AO decreases motivation. So if I just had, 100 cookies, I'm not really that motivated for more cookies. So let's say you're working with a kiddo in the home, and they have just eaten lunch when you got there to do your session. Well, food is probably not something they're deprived of at this moment. So using additional food items as reinforcers will probably not, be that motivating. It'll probably not pack that big of a reinforcing punch. When you say, "Okay, touch nose," and the kid touches their nose, and then you give them a bite of sandwich or something like that, that's probably not going to be that motivating right after lunch. Now, if they haven't eaten lunch, maybe your session is right before dinner, that might be very reinforcing. And of course, it doesn't only apply to tangible things like food. If they've just spent the last 15 minutes playing with their truck or their action figure, additional time to play with action figure is not going to be that reinforcing because they're satiated on playing with an action figure. So that's going to be a very weak reinforcer to use, and they're not going to be very motivated to work hard to earn that reinforcer. In contrast, if they have not played with their action figure for a long time, they're going to be in a state of deprivation of that action figure. Or if they haven't eaten, they're going to be in a state of food deprivation or drink deprivation. Or if they've just been running a lot, they may be in a state of rest deprivation. I haven't had sushi in a long time, so I'm in a state of sushi deprivation. People are more motivated to engage in a behavior that will produce the reinforcer they're deprived of. So if you're thinking about what reinforcer should I use, we've just, the last 3 trials of touch nose or come here, I've let them play with their action figures. Well, you may want to consider, is the kid getting satiated on action figures? Maybe I need to switch it up and use a different reinforcer that I haven't used in a while, because hopefully they're going to be deprived of that other reinforcer. And what you're trying to do is keep the kid, by rotating through different reinforcers, keep the kid in a state of deprivation for any one of them. right? Because by doing that, you're going to keep their motivation to work for those reinforcers high. Obviously, if you don't do that and the kid slips into a state of satiation, you're going to find it a lot harder to get compliance to your demands. You're going to be seeing kids, not work as hard for you and maybe even completely disengage. So it's really important to be aware of the concept of deprivation and, of course, the concept of satiation so that you can be considering this when you're using different reinforcers. I don't know, again, how in-depth the BCAT exam is going to ask you about deprivation and satiation, but, there's two types of EOs, and I'm going to go ahead and put them in the chat so you guys can see them. There's two types. One is state of deprivation, which we talked about, but there's actually a second type of EO. The second type of EO is a state of aversive stimulation. So if you think about what motivates people, people are motivated by a state of deprivation. So if I'm deprived of food, I'm motivated to engage in a behavior that will produce food. If I'm deprived of water, these are both unconditioned reinforcers, I'm motivated to engage in some behavior that will produce water. No, the BCAT is a multiple choice test. So I don't think you're going to have to do any short answers, thank God, right? So if I'm deprived of any of those things, or if I'm deprived of conditioned reinforcers too, if I'm deprived of praise or letter grade A or dollar bills or tokens, I will engage, right? I will engage in behaviors that will produce praise, produce tokens, produce dollar bills. So that's one type of EO, that state of deprivation. But the other type of motivation, or the other type of establishing operation, is a state of aversive stimulation. This is a state of pain. When you're in a state of pain, you're motivated to get out of that state of pain. If I have a headache, that's a state of aversive stimulation. I'm in a state of pain. I'm motivated to do whatever it takes to get out of that state of pain. And so I will do a behavior that will produce negative reinforcement in this case, relief from that pain. So I'll take an aspirin, or I'll, massage my temples, or something like that. If I've, if I've just, pulled a muscle when in my calf when I was running, I'm going to do a behavior that's going to reduce the pain. I'm going to start walking or limping, because by walking or limping, that reduces the strain or the pain that I feel. Therefore, limping is reinforced. Walking is reinforced when you have a cramp in your leg. And so when I'm motivated to escape that pain, I'm more likely to limp and walk. So those are your two basic types of establishing operations. It's not just deprivation. It's also a state of pain, or more typically we call it a state of aversive stimulation. And then there's also two types of abolishing operations. The first type we've already covered is satiation. This is where you've had a lot of something. You've had a lot of food, or you've had a lot of drink. And so you're no longer motivated to get additional food or additional drink or additional praise or, maybe additional dollars. You have to be really rich, but perhaps there's a level of satiation that can be achieved. The other type of abolishing operation is called homeostasis, and that's kind of a crazy word, but think like the Goldilocks effect, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. Homeostasis means you're at the perfect stimulation level. So, for example, Goldilocks, right? The porridge was not too hot, not too cold. It was just right. Any hotter, it would be too hot. Any colder, it would be too cold. The bed that Goldilocks eventually slept in was just the right amount of softness. Not too firm, not too soft. It was just right. It was that homeostasis, that middle ground. So when we're in a state of homeostasis, we're not too hot, we're not too cold, right? It's just right. Any change in either direction, either a change towards the warmer or the change towards the cooler will be taking us away from that perfect happy medium, that homeostasis. And therefore, we're not motivated. It basically, it abolishes any motivation to go hotter or go colder. But it's not just hot and cold. It also has to do with our arousal levels. Let's say, we all have like kind of a baseline or homeostatic arousal level. We're not too over-aroused. We're not too bored or under-aroused. We're kind of just right. Now, let's say we go to the DMV and we're standing in line, and now we're really bored. Now we slip out of homeostasis and go to a state of under-arousal or boredom. And so maybe we go on our phone and check Facebook or play Angry Birds or something like that to bring our arousal levels, our stimulation levels, back up out of boredom towards that homeostasis happy medium, that Goldilocks effect, right? And so we engage in behaviors. We could call them self-stimulatory behaviors. They're appropriate, of course, but that increase our arousal levels. Now, many kids with autism, when they're unengaged, what do? They hand flap, they rock back and forth, they engage in incoherent vocalizations. Many of them engage in that to take themselves back up out of boredom into that happy medium, that Goldilocks effect, that homeostasis area. And by the way, it can happen when you're over-aroused too. When we are over-aroused, we do a number of appropriate behaviors that get the wiggles out. And I'm putting air quotes around when I say get the wiggles out, right? We might do yoga or go get a massage or share our excitement. If our over-arousal is not a frustration, but an excitement over-arousal, we may just talk, because we have good verbal skills, about what we're excited about. Wow, I'm so excited for Halloween. We're going to dress up as whatever, and it's going to be so much fun. Well, by sharing our excitement, we get it off our chest, right? We get the wiggles out, and that allows us to return from a state of over-excitation back down to that Goldilocks state, that homeostasis. Now, of course, if our over-arousal is frustration, we may also talk about that with our significant others. God, I'm so frustrated, I've got all these reports due, or, whatever, or, whatever, right? We might talk about it, but we engage in other behaviors that produce a reduction in over-arousal. It brings us back down to homeostasis. We might drink alcohol to escape pain, right, and bring us back down to a homeostatic feeling. We may do yoga or something more healthy than drinking to also bring ourselves down if we're over-aroused. So we all engage in self-stimulatory behaviors that help us regulate our stimulation level and bring us back to this state of homeostasis. And when you're in homeostasis, when you're in that Goldilocks zone, you're not motivated to get out of it. You're not motivated to get more aroused or less aroused, more warm or colder. You're in that happy medium. So that is an abolishing operation. It kills any motivation to do a behavior that would change that, because we like being in our homeostatic state. Of course, our kids with autism, if they're over-aroused, they may engage in self-stimulatory behaviors to bring themselves from a state of over-arousal back down to homeostasis. They may, if they're frustrated, tantrum, or maybe I've seen some kids bite their own hand or push on their chin, or they may hand flap or something like that, right? So our kids with autism do their own self-regulatory behaviors, but that brings them down to homeostasis. The only problem with that is that the ones they do are quote-unquote, weird. And I'm putting weird in quotation marks because weird is defined by society. So anyway, you should be aware. I don't know if the BCAT exam will require you to know that level of detail about, deprivation is one type of motivation, but the other one is aversive stimulation. And then satiation is one type of abolishing operation, which kills motivation, as is that homeostasis, that happy medium. So you may not need to know that, but now you have it in case you do, with a little explanation. If there's no questions, I'm going to go ahead and move on to number 12, which is contingency. All contingency means is what is the behavior requirement to earn the reinforcer or to earn the punisher. So a contingency is usually, they usually talk about it in terms of the three-term contingency, which is actually number 17 on this list. But more generally, a contingency would be like saying, okay, contingent on you cleaning your room, you will earn $1. That's a contingency right there. So there's a behavior is specified that needs to be done, and then a consequence is specified. So that would be like a contingency to earn a reward or a reinforcer. But there could also be contingencies to earn a punisher, right? If you break the law, if you speed in your car and a police officer gets you, you will get a speeding ticket. That's also a contingency. So that's all they mean by a contingency. In the behavioral world, and specifically with kids with autism, the contingencies that we have for the child is when we give an instruction, the child complies, the child gets some kind of positive reinforcer, like touch your nose, the child touches their nose, the child is told, good job! That's a contingency right there. And of course, because it has an antecedent, a behavior, and a consequence, that's also a 3-term contingency. So that's all a contingency is. Motivating operation, I already talked about those. That's your EO and AO. So motivating operation is the umbrella term for establishing operation and abolishing operation. So motivating operation is the umbrella term for EO and AO. So when they talk about motivating operations, they could mean establishing operation or they could mean abolishing operation. In most situations, people don't say motivating operations. In most situations, they usually say EO or AO, or if they're going to say the whole word, they say establishing operation or abolishing operation. Because just by saying motivating operation, it doesn't specify which type of motivating operation you're talking about. It doesn't specify whether you're referring to an EO or an AO. So that's what motivating operation is. Antecedent behavior consequence. I think everyone knows what these are, but just for the heck of it. An antecedent is the thing that comes before the behavior, and there's a couple different types of antecedents. The two that we're most familiar with are going to be an SD, which is number 19, a discriminative stimulus. And then the other one is actually that we're probably should be pretty familiar with is the EO, the establishing operation, which I already talked about, so I'm not going to talk about it again. Those are your two most common antecedents, but basically those are the things that come before the behavior. Number 15, of course, is the behavior. That is the thing the kid does, or if you're talking about our behavior, that's the thing that we do. So, whatever the behavior is, right? It's the observable, measurable thing. And I'll give an example of A, B, and C in just a moment. And then the consequence, which rounds out our 3-term contingency, is how the environment responds to the behavior. So the consequence is either going to be a positive reinforcement, a negative reinforcement, a positive punishment, or a negative punishment. So a consequence will be one of those 4 things. So, for example, a red light would be an antecedent, which would trigger my behavior of pressing the brakes on my car, which would result in the consequence of, not getting killed or not getting a ticket at the best. So a green light is an antecedent that triggers my behavior of, pressing the gas, which produces the consequence of getting to my destination. For us working with kids with autism, we say touch nose, or, the kid touches their nose, that's their behavior, which produces the consequence of good job, or something like that. Now, by the way, we could say the antecedent touch nose, and the kid could do a non-response, then that's their behavior, which the consequence might be, nope, try again, or something like that. So that's your antecedent behavior consequence. And when you look at all 3 of those together, we collectively call those 3 things the 3-term contingency, because the 3-term contingency is a contingency that stipulates the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. Number 18, stimulus. Stimulus is usually the term used to describe a neutral stimulus. And that's going to be, I'm going to contrast that in a moment with a discriminative stimulus. So when you see it as just stimulus, and it doesn't say discriminative stimulus, usually when you see just the word stimulus, it usually means a neutral stimulus. So this would be a stimulus that has not acquired any stimulus control, which we're going to talk about in a minute as well. A neutral stimulus would be like the very first time you ever told a child, touch Achilles tendon, right? The kid has no idea what the hell their Achilles tendon is. So when you say touch Achilles tendon, that stimulus does not have any stimulus control. It doesn't mean anything to the child yet because they have no idea what their Achilles tendon is, right? So that's a neutral stimulus in the child's eyes, at least. It's a neutral stimulus. You know, the first time or even the first few times the child hears that, it may be a neutral stimulus. If I had said blah, 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 that's a neutral stimulus because you have no idea what you're supposed to do. It doesn't distinguish or tell you. Blah, blah, blah doesn't tell you what behavior you need to do. Just like for the child who doesn't know what their Achilles tendon is, saying touch Achilles tendon doesn't distinguish or discriminate what behavior they should do. That's why it's not a discriminative stimulus. It's just a neutral stimulus. So basically, when you see the word stimulus, it just means a neutral stimulus. This is any antecedent event that has not been learned what it means, right? It has no meaning yet. It's just neutral. So let me give you a couple other examples. If you saw a part of a motor, and if you're not a mechanic, you probably look at that part of the motor and go, I have no idea what that's used for. That would be a neutral stimulus to you because it has no, it doesn't direct you on what to do. Just like saying touch Achilles tendon may not direct a child with autism on what to do. It's basically a neutral stimulus. In contrast to a neutral stimulus, a discriminative stimulus, the kid has learned the meaning of that stimulus. In other words, the kid has learned what that stimulus, what I should do when that stimulus is presented. So when I say touch nose, assuming the kid has learned what that means, now touch nose is not a neutral stimulus, it's now a discriminative stimulus because it discriminates or tells the child what you should be doing. When my doorbell rings, it discriminates I should walk over to the door and open the door, maybe look through the peephole first, right? Versus when my phone rings, that discriminates for me to look at the caller ID and then eventually answer the phone, assuming I want to. So those are discriminative stimuli. They all have meaning. They all have been learned through a history of reinforcement or a history of punishment, by the way, that this thing means something. So for example, a green light is a discriminative stimulus to press the gas. A red light is a discriminative stimulus to press the brake because doing pressing the gas in the presence of a green light was reinforced. Pressing brake in the presence of a red light was also reinforced. Now, by the way, each of those things can also be a discriminative stimulus for a certain thing to not do, right? So like pressing the gas when the stimulus is a red light is going to be very bad. And if you've ever done that and you got in an accident, it resulted in punishment. So a red light also is not only a discriminative stimulus to press the brake, but it's also a discriminative stimulus to not press the gas. Technically, they call that an SDP, or a punishment discriminative stimulus, but I don't see that on the BCAT slide, on the BCAT handout, so they probably won't go into that depth. But just kind of for your purposes, a discriminative stimulus is an antecedent stimulus that was initially neutral and now signals that doing a certain behavior will produce reinforcement. That's like the textbook definition of a discriminative stimulus. Sometimes a discriminative stimulus is also called an SD. Signals that reinforcement is available for doing a specific behavior. So a discriminative stimulus signals that reinforcement is available for doing a specific behavior. So, a red light signals that reinforcement is available for pressing the brakes. A green light signals that reinforcement is available for pressing the gas. When Jared says touch nose, that signals that reinforcement is available if little Johnny touches his own nose. So that's basically what an SD is. Stimulus control is the effect a discriminative stimulus has on behavior. So stimulus control is the effect or control an SD has on the specific behavior. So a A red light has control over my behavior of pressing the brakes. A green light has control over my behavior pushing the gas. When I say touch nose, that has control over Johnny's behavior of reaching his finger up to his nose and touching it. Things like that. So that's what stimulus control is. And the way stimulus control develops is it's over time. There has to be a lot of learning trials for stimulus control to develop. It doesn't develop just over one trial for most people. Most people, when they say, "Oh, it takes me a couple times to learn something," what they're really saying is that it takes me a couple times to learn stimulus control. It takes a couple of times for an antecedent to eventually control behavior. So that's why when we were kids, we did lots and lots of math problems, and we had to learn multiple examples of adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing so that we could learn how to do math. And probably when you guys were learning ABA, you needed lots and lots of examples of negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement or negative punishment or positive punishment in order for you to really learn what a negative punishment is, what positive punishment is, what negative reinforcement is, what positive reinforcement is. And the only way each one of those developed stimulus control for you was for sometimes you to get it wrong and you were put on extinction and your supervisor said, "Nope, that's not correct," or maybe you were punished. Like you said, "No, that's not correct." And then sometimes you got it right and your supervisor said, "Yeah, that's exactly what positive reinforcement is," or "Yeah, that's exactly what negative reinforcement is. Good job." And so over many, many trials, you learned what that antecedent meant and what to do when that antecedent was presented. And that's the same reason we do many, many trials with the kids with autism, because just like the rest of us, it may take a kid with autism many, many trials to learn how to touch their nose, or how to, one second, I see that note, or how to come here, or how to respond, "I'm fine," when the SD is, "How are you doing?" Just to be sure, an SD and is a non-neutral stimulus, and showing that reinforcement are available. So an SD signals that reinforcement is available if a certain behavior is done. Whereas a neutral stimulus doesn't signal anything. It's just neutral. It would be like if I had said blah, blah, blah. It doesn't mean anything to you. An SD signals that reinforcement's available. So, if I see a light switch, that's, I'm in a dark room, a light switch is an SD that signals I should do what behavior? Yeah, an SD is showing that reinforcement is available. Yeah, you should turn it on, exactly. So a light switch is an SD that signals if you flip it up, reinforcement is available. The little lever on your refrigerator that says ice, if you push that button and then depress the lever, that lever is a SD signaling that reinforcement, assuming you want ice, right? Assuming you're in a state of ice deprivation, maybe. That lever, or the little button that says ice, is an SD that signals that reinforcement is available for doing a specific behavior, depressing the lever. So I think you guys have an idea of it. An SD signals that reinforcement is available. Good, I'm glad it's helpful. So, I don't think the BCAT exam is going to go into a great level of detail, because there is more detail we could go into, but I feel like I'm fairly certain the BCAT's not going to go crazy, and that it's going to be like this grad school level detail that you need to go into. So I think I'm going to leave it at that for SD and stimulus control. Just remember, an SD signals that reinforcement's available, whereas a neutral stimulus doesn't signal anything. The response is the same thing as the behavior. So behavior and response, so number 15 and number 21 are pretty much used interchangeably. Sometimes if someone's being really like ABA nerdy, they may say, well, a response is a single occurrence of a behavior, but most people, it's going to be used interchangeably, so I don't think you need to worry about that one. Yes, I'll go over the three-term contingency again. So the three-term contingency includes what three things? You've got the A, the B, and the C, right? You got your antecedent, your behavior, and your consequence. Those are your three terms in the three-term contingency. So your antecedent, again, an antecedent can mean one of two things, either the SD or the EO. So there's a couple, actually there's more types of antecedents besides SD and EO. There's actually something called an S delta, but I don't think you're going to need to know about that one. And there's also something called an SD P, and I can't make the P superscript, so I'm going to make it subscript. And then, of course, there's an AO, which we already talked about. So the EO and the AO we already talked about. That's the establishing operation or the abolishing operation. That's the thing that increases motivation or decreases motivation. An SD signals that reinforcement's available. An SDP is some kind of signal that signals punishment is available. So imagine when you were in school, if you saw the bully, that bully would be an SDP, right? Because the bully signals that punishment is available if you get too close to him. You know, maybe he gives you a wedgie or something like that. You know, and something, by the way, can be an SD for one behavior and an SDP for another behavior. So I gave you the example of a red light. A red light is an SD to press the brakes, and it's a SDP to press the gas. Because a red light signals that reinforcement's available for pressing the brakes, but a red light also signals simultaneously that punishment is available for pressing the gas. So a red light can be simultaneously an SD for one behavior and an SDP for a different behavior. And I don't really want to go into that level of detail because I don't think the BCAT exam is going to go into that kind of detail. I really just don't, I just can't see this being like an entry-level test to be that kind of stuff, because that's really more of like a graduate level question. And an S delta is a signal that extinction is available. So SD signals reinforcement is available for doing a specific behavior. God, my typing is atrocious. And S delta signals that extinction is available for doing a certain behavior. And an SDP signals that punishment is available for doing a certain behavior. And I'll give you a real quick example of each one of those. So let's say you're a new kid at a new school, and today is your first day at the new school. And there are three people that during recess you see. One of them is Billy, and we'll say for simplicity purposes, Billy is the bully. And another one is, Johnny, and Johnny is nice. And the other one is the teacher aide. All right? So you have Billy the bully, Johnny, and the teacher aide. And so you're the new kid at school and you're at recess. And right now, because you've never met any of those three people, all of them are neutral at this moment to you. So none of them signal anything yet to you. They're all neutral. So let's say you go up to Billy and you say, Billy, do you want to play with me? And Billy, because he's the bully, punches you in the nose. So now you have one learning trial. You have one history of punishment for the behavior asking Billy, do you want to play? So now you go up to Johnny and you say, Johnny, do you want to play? And with Johnny you play and you have a great time. And then later you go ask the teacher aide and you say, do you want to play? And the teacher aide says, no, I'm here as the yard duty. I don't play with the students. And so you were put on extinction for asking the yard duty or the teacher aide to play, because the teacher didn't hurt you. The teacher didn't punish you per se. She basically the teacher aide just put you on extinction by saying, no, I don't play during recess. And so now you have these three trials of learning. And of course, maybe if you're not a very bright kid at this new school, it may take you multiple trials to learn that Billy's mean, Johnny's nice, and the teacher aide never plays with you. But hopefully, it doesn't take you very long. So after maybe several trials, Billy is no longer neutral. Johnny is no longer neutral, and the teacher aide is no longer neutral. Billy signals that punishment is available for doing the behavior, do you want to play? Johnny signals that reinforcement is available for doing the behavior, do you want to play? And the teacher aide signals that extinction is available for the behavior, do you want to play? In other words, Billy is an SDP, Johnny is an SD, and the teacher aide is an S delta. So again, that's kind of how it works in the real world to develop into an SD, an SDP, or an S delta. I don't really think the BCAT exam is going to go into that level of detail, though. I really think you want to focus on just the SD, which is how something signals that reinforcement's available. And since the original question was about the three-term contingency, most of the time, the three terms, antecedent, behavior, and consequence, when it's the antecedent, you're just talking about the establishing operation and the SD. The behavior or the response is the second term. That's what the child does. And the consequence is one of those four consequences, either a positive reinforcer, negative reinforcer, positive punisher, or negative punisher. So it's, those are your three consequences. And the basic way of saying that is, how does the environment react to the behavior, right? So that's your three-term contingency. Does that sort of clarify it, or did I just confuse you more? So we can give me like a thumbs up if there's that option. All right, moving on. Thank you, Rochelle. Discrete trial. So let me scroll down a little bit. A discrete trial is using the three-term contingency to teach something. That's all it really is. So the antecedent is touch nose, and the behavior is the kid touching their nose, and the consequence is good job. Now, of course, because you guys do discrete trials all day long with the kiddos you work with, you know that there is variations on that. Of course, it might be touch nose, it might be touch ears, it might be touch head, it might be come here, it might be questions like what's your name, it might be, whatever the SD is. And then the response that the child gives, it could be either a correct response or an incorrect response or a non-response. And then the consequence would be whatever the consequences are. And basically, when you do discrete trials, you have that three-term contingency, and then there's a fourth thing that you usually do, and I'm not sure if it's even known that you even do it because it's done automatically, and it's called the inter-trial interval. Inter-trial, oops, I'm going to type that out for you. Inter-trial interval, sometimes it's called the ITI. The inter-trial interval is the time between the first discrete trial and the second discrete trial. So imagine you're working with a kid doing mass trials. That's where you ask kind of the same question or give the same directive over and over again. Like say, touch nose, and the kid does it. Good job. Touch nose, and the kid does it. Good job. Touch nose. You're going through mass trials over and over and over again, just for practice. There's a space between the first trial, or like a pause, basically, between the first trial and the second trial, right? So it's actually, technically, it's between the consequence of the first trial and then the delivery of the SD of the second trial. So you say, let's say the first trial was, Johnny, touch nose, and then the kid touches their nose, and you say, great job! And then there's this sort of like pause or moment of silence. That pause or moment of silence is called the intertrial interval. And the purpose of the intertrial interval when you're doing discrete trial training is there's a couple of purposes. The first purpose of the intertrial interval is to allow the consequence to sink in, right? You want the consequence to sink in for the child, like, oh, he said good job. That must mean touching nose, I should do that more in the future. Or, of course, if the consequence was, no, try again, or something like that, you want that consequence to sink in as well. So that pause is, one of the reasons for that pause is to allow the consequence to kind of sink into the child. The other reason for having the intertrial interval is for the staff, for you guys as the direct staff, to get the second trial ready. So a lot of the times when you're doing like discrete trial training, you need stimuli. Like you're saying, maybe it's not touch nose or touch ear or something like that, but you're saying like you've got like, farm animals or something like that in front of the kid, and they're laying out on the carpet or at the table, and you have to like take one of the farm animals away and put a new farm animal on the table to get it ready. So the intertrial interval is your time as the staff to get the stimuli ready for the next trial. So that's the other purpose of the intertrial interval. So a discrete trial is really your ABC, your three-term contingency, plus the intertrial interval. And so that's really what a discrete trial is. All right. Moving on. All right, making good time. Okay, so I'll get to discrimination training in a minute, since we were just talking about discrete trials. Well, no, I will go discrimination training next. Okay. So discrimination training is basically, the most basic way I can talk about discrimination training is when you are teaching the child, whatever it is you're trying to teach them, right? So if you're trying to teach them their body parts, and you're saying touch nose, touch ears, touch eyes, or if you're trying to teach them how to have a conversation, and you're teaching them to ask follow-up questions or answer questions or make comments, and you're going through the drills, that's discrimination training. Whoops, that's discrimination training. So the way discrimination training works is that you have to have an SD, and the kid has to get it correct sometimes, and the kid has to get it incorrect sometimes for them to begin to discriminate what that SD means. In other words, discrimination training is the process to teach stimulus control, which we talked about earlier. So let's say you have, I don't know, I'm just going to use a very simple example. Let's say you're trying to teach the child colors, okay? And so you have an index card in front of, actually you have two index cards in front of the child. You have a blue index card and a red index card. And you say, touch blue. And the child touches the blue index card. You say, yeah, that's awesome. That's right. That is the blue index card. So that's one trial that the child is then logging in their head. Okay, Jared said touch blue. I did this. I reached out my hand and I touched this index card, and I got things I like. So then maybe you switch the side, so now the blue index card is on the other side. And you say, touch blue. And this time the kid gets it wrong. They touch the red index card. And so you say, no, try again. So now, again, they log that trial of learning in their head. They say, okay, Jared said touch blue. I touched this index card, or I reached my hand out and touched this one, and I didn't get the things I like. I got told no. And depending on how quickly of a learner the child is, it may take them 10 trials, 20 trials, 100 trials, but eventually they're touching blue index card 80% of the time across 3 different sittings, 2 different instructors, blah, 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 mastery, and we say, okay, the kid knows blue index card. So now stimulus control is mastered for touch blue. And with that, because that saying touch blue now signals that reinforcement is available for touching this index card. And of course, the other index card, the red index card, is an S delta because it signals that no reinforcement is available. And that process, let's say that took 100 trials. Those 100 trials that it took for the kid to master that was the discrimination training. You were training them to discriminate what to do when you say touch blue. So you have now completed discrimination training for touch blue. And then, now, if now blue is mastered, you may now move on to discrimination training for a different color, like maybe touch red, or maybe you go into a different color completely, like touch green or touch yellow. And the same process repeats itself where you have a green index card and an index card that's a different color. And so when you say touch green, sometimes the child gets it right, sometimes the child gets it wrong. they log that information in their sort of history of reinforcement and punishment. I guess you could call that, log that information in their mind. And over time, it may take them 10 trials, 20 trials, 30 trials, or 100 trials, or maybe more. They're eventually going to learn that when you say touch blue, I touch this index card. When you say touch green, I touch this index card. When you say touch pink, I touch this index card. Just like when you say touch nose, I touch this body part. When you say touch ears, I touch this body part. When you say how are you, I say I'm fine. When you say how old are you, I say I'm 10 years old, right? And through our discrete trial training, the child learns to discriminate what each neutral antecedent means. And eventually, after discrimination training is done, all of those neutral antecedents are no longer neutral antecedents. They are now SDs, or discriminative stimuli, because they now have meaning. They now signal a specific behavior to do. And so the process of discrimination training is how we teach something to acquire or to become an SD. So it goes from a neutral antecedent to becoming an SD through the process of discrimination training. And so that's why we do all of these trials over and over and over, all day long, collect all this data. So that's discrimination training. There are different methods, though, for getting a kid to discriminate that this card is blue and that card is red and this card is green. The way that you guys are probably most familiar with is called discrete trial training. Discrete trial training is basically a drill-based teaching methodology where you just drill over and over and over and over again, just like, ad nauseum, something you're trying to teach, whether it's colors you're trying to teach or body parts you're trying to teach or, conversations that you're trying to teach or mans or tacts or whatever, echoics, whatever it is you're trying to teach, self-help skills, you're going to practice many, many, many times in kind of a drill-based teaching format. That drill-based teaching format is called discrete trial training. Again, I'm not sure what kind of depth the BCAT exam is going to be asking you questions about discrete trial training, but there are 4 stages to discrete trial training. So I'm going to go over them very briefly now. Let's see. Stage 1 is called mass trials. Stage 2 is called block trials. So you should be at least familiar with these names. Stage 3 is called expanded trials, and you guys should be familiar with these from the ABA workshop that you guys did. And stage 4 is called random rotation. Just briefly, I'll go into each one of these 4 stages of discrete trial training very briefly, because I don't think the BCAT exam is going to go to this level of detail, but just so you're familiar. So in mass trials, it's basically the same SD over and over and over and over and over again. Touch blue, touch blue, touch blue, touch blue, touch blue, touch blue. You may do this 10 to 20 times. And so basically that's how the drill plays out. In block trials, the drill is usually a block of one SD and then a block of another SD. So block trials is usually used when the kid's getting confused between 2 colors. So let's say purple and blue are getting confused because they're very similar in color. So you might do touch blue, touch blue, touch blue, touch blue, and then touch purple, touch purple, touch purple, touch purple, touch purple. And then you may go back to another block of blue, 4 or 5 trials of blue, and then another block of purple, 4 or 5 trials of purple. And the idea of block trials is to kind of help the child distinguish or discriminate blue versus purple. The third stage, expanded trials, is going to be an SD and then some kind of distraction trial. And then you're going to go back to the SD to see if they can remember what to do. And if they can, then you're going to do 2 distraction trials. And then come back to the SD to see if they can remember what to do. And if they can, then you're going to do 3 distraction trials and come back to the SD. So it would be kind of like this. Let's say you're teaching them blue, so we'll stick with that example. and they already know how to clap. So clapping is a skill that they've already mastered previously. You might say, touch blue, you know, and you've got the blue card versus the red card. You say, touch blue, and the kid does it correctly. So they say, good job, clap hands. And what you're trying to do there is have them to focus on a different task, kind of distract them from the blue. And then, if you know, after they clap their hands, you come back and say, okay, touch blue, and to see if they can kind of get it right after being distracted. And if they do, then you're going to do 2 distraction tasks. Clap hands, you know, I don't know what and then you could do clap hands twice, I guess, or you could do something another thing they've already mastered, like clap hands, touch head, and then you go touch blue, and then if they get it right, now you do 3 distraction tasks. Clap hands, touch head, touch nose, and then you go back to the blue again, touch blue. So the idea with phase 3 in discrete trial training, which is expanded trials, is to really try to distract the child, to see if you can kind of throw them off and if they can come back and get focused and get it correct. And then the 4th stage in discrete trial training is called random rotation. And basically that's where you're asking for a bunch of different things, like a bunch of different skills at random. So the SDs are constantly changing. It's like touch blue, touch red, touch purple, touch green, touch blue again. You know, you don't have to say again, but like you just go through a bunch of different SDs, and you're basically doing like you're randomly asking for different things, different skills. And that's the hardest stage. So if the kid's mastering it, you know, at 80% correct responding in random rotation, usually at that point we say the kid's mastered it. All right, so those are the 4 stages of discrete trial training. I don't know if the BCAT exam will go into that level of detail, but you should at least be familiar. It's mass trials, block trials, expanded trials, and random rotation. Another way or another methodology of teaching kids with autism that has evidence-based research to support it, besides discrete trial training, and discrete trial training, which is also shortened for DTT, was primarily pioneered by the work of Lovaas. So I had referenced him before with the 1987 study. DTT, or discrete trial training, was pioneered by Lovaas. And natural environment training, this is, one second, natural environment training is most often referenced with PRT. It's called pivotal response training. Pivotal response training is pioneered by the work of Kegel and Kegel. So let me, it'll take me a second to type that out, so give me just a moment. And also my screen went dark, so I need to update, add some battery. All right. NET, or natural environment training, most often they're talking about pivotal response training, or PRT. Pivotal response training and natural environment training are used interchangeably in most cases. And pivotal response training, or PRT, was pioneered by the works of Kegel and Kegel. It was a husband and wife team out of UC Santa Barbara. And so the difference between natural environment training and discrete trial training is just the method by which the skills are taught. So whereas discrete trial training is very drill-based, very repetitious, natural environment training is much more, well, as the name makes you infer, it's much more naturalistic. You would like set up opportunities for the kid to practice the skill rather than doing it like in an artificial drill, like over and over and over again. So for example, let's say you were wanting to practice colors. Rather than having an index card that was blue and an index card that was red, and then just doing like mass trials, block trials, expanded trials, and a random rotation to drill red, 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 or blue, 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 you might be going a walk. And as you happen to pass a flower that happens to be red, you might say, you know, point to the red flower or something like that. Or you see like a mailbox and it's painted blue, you might, in the natural context of that walk, say, you know, point to the blue mailbox, or what color is it if you're working on labels. something like that. So the repetition is achieved not by drilling per se, but the repetition is achieved by setting up naturally occurring opportunities. Maybe you have the kid help the mom do laundry, and as the clothes are coming out of the dryer, the mom is asking the kid, what color is this sock, or point to the red sock, or point to the blue sock, or something like that. So pivotal response training or natural environment training seeks to achieve that repetition that kids with autism need to learn by setting up or contriving natural opportunities. And the reason there's some benefit to that is because sometimes when colors or anything, any skill for that matter, is taught in a decontextualized format or a decontextualized setting, it doesn't generalize to the real world, to the natural environment, because it was too artificial, and I had used that term earlier. Whereas if the teaching methodology is actually already natural, it's a more it's almost like you're teaching it incidentally. If the teaching methodology is already more natural, you tend to see better generalization to the real world or to the natural environment. And so you end up with better generalization, essentially. So that's the main difference between discrete trial training and natural environment training. Discrete trial training is kind of contrived, decontextualized, and drill-based. Natural environment training is more natural, although you can kind of set up opportunities where these skills can be practiced, but it's going to be done in more of a natural and kind of a looser, more free-floating context. 4, fluency-based training. Fluency-based training is basically the most common way of doing fluency-based training is called precision teaching. I'll note that right here, precision teaching. And what that is basically trying to get as many correct responses in a short amount of time as possible. So imagine you were doing flashcards with a kid, and he had mastered all of them, at 80% accuracy across 2 different instructors, 3 consecutive sittings. But he was kind of slow. Like you would hold up a flashcard and you say, "What is it?" And the kid says, "Dog." And that's correct, but it was just kind of slow. Well, in the real world, he's going to need to answer his peers quicker than that. If his peer says, "Do you want to play?" and he goes, "Yes," the peer is going to think he's weird, right? So mastery does not mean it's fluent. Fluent means it's mastered and it's fast, or fast and accurate. That's what fluency means. Fast and accurate. So mastery really only means accurate. It doesn't mean fast. And so the way we teach the kid to be fast and accurate or fluent is to do drills in a very short time span and at a very rapid pace. And we're going to talk a little bit later about pacing. And I know we have about a half hour left. So I'm going to speed up the movement a little bit here, speaking of pacing. And so basically fluency-based training is when you do drills at a very fast pace and it's an incorrect response if they don't respond right away. Or another way of doing it is if they don't answer a certain number of questions within a minute. So like let's say if you don't do 20 flashcards within a minute, you don't get your reward or your reinforcer. So you have to get over 20 per minute. So your rate is 20 per minute. And then once their rate is 20 per minute, you might move it up to, okay, now you got to get to 25 per minute. And the reinforcer is only delivered if they get 25 correct per minute, or 30 correct per minute, or 35 correct per minute. Because the idea is we want to go beyond just mastered, we want to go to fluency. Because in the real world, you have to be able to respond fluently to all sorts of situations. So that's what fluency-based training is. Generalization, we've already touched on this, but generalization is when the skill is learned in a training setting, it's utilized in a novel setting where no training ever occurred. So let's say you practice come here at home, but then the kid does it at school when a peer says come here. There was no training with that peer or in that setting, but the kid still came over when the peer said, "Hey, come here, I want to show you something." So that's generalization. And generalization can really occur with different people. So like, you know, you taught him to come here, but now he comes here with a peer. So there's generalization, generalization across people. There's also generalization across settings. So like you taught him to come here at home, but now he also comes here with you at school. That would be generalization across settings. And then there's generalization across, sometimes it's called stimuli, sometimes it's called materials. Depends on who you ask. But like, let's say we taught the kid to label this thing a chair, and it was a chair, like a dining room chair, and it has 4 legs and like a cushion. But then you show them another chair that's not the dining chair. Let's say it's like a stool or a sofa chair, or maybe like an office chair that has wheels, and the kid still calls it a chair. That's generalizing within the stimuli or within the category of chair. So they made generalization without actually having to be taught that that office chair was a chair. So those are really your 3 areas of generalization. Similar to generalization is maintenance. Maintenance is when the kid maintains that skill over a long period of time. So for example, in high school, I took Spanish, and I haven't maintained all my Spanish, but I've maintained a decent portion of my Spanish. So at least for some things, I've maintained that skill. I haven't ridden a bike for many, many years, but I've maintained that skill of riding a bike. You know, I've obviously maintained the skill of tying my shoes, even though the training for my shoe tying ended many, many years ago. So that's all maintenance is. The way we promote maintenance with our kiddos is by, there's several ways. One way of promoting maintenance incorporate caregivers, right? Parent training. And that's in big caps because that's really important. If the caregivers are participating and they're aware of what goals are being worked on, then they're going to be able to help maintain and generalize those skills. Another one is use intermittent reinforcement. And I don't know, I think we'll talk about intermittent reinforcement in a little bit. Intermittent reinforcement means don't reinforce every single time. When we're first teaching a skill, we reinforce the kid every single time, right? We say, touch nose, and they do it, great job, touch nose, great job, touch nose, great job. But eventually, you don't want to reinforce them every single time they touch their nose, because in the real world, we don't get reinforced every time we do a behavior. You know, it's not like every time I hold the door for someone, they tell me thank you. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's not like every time I give eye contact, someone says, good job, Jared, for giving eye contact, right? So if we're really trying to get this behavior to maintain in the real world, we have to set the child's expectations up that, hey, you're not going to get reinforced every time, so don't expect it. You have to maintain this behavior even when you're not getting reinforced every time. And so another way of promoting maintenance is to use intermittent reinforcement. And then, you know, basically, there's a few other ways, but those are the 2 main ways that you need to know about, I would say. Number 7 is caregiver training. We really already talked about that, so that really has to do with maintenance and generalization. Obviously, it's also required by law and the contracts that California PsyCare and ART have with the health plans. So besides being a policy or a contractual obligation, caregiver training is also a best practice for the reasons I just described, because it promotes maintenance and generalization. Caregiver training is oftentimes done in like a tell, show, do methodology. So you tell the parents what you want them to do, you then model prompt it or show them what you want them to do, and then you have them do it, and then you give them feedback, right? So sometimes that's called behavioral skills training, and basically what that means is that you actually will set up like a task analysis for the parent, and it's like, okay, this is how you do a discrete trial, Mom. First you give the SD. The SD is touch nose. If Johnny gets it right, you say good job. If Johnny gets it wrong, you say try again, and then you do the SD all over again. You know, blah 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 blah. And you can actually do like set up a task analysis whether the parent did step 1, step 2, step 3 correctly in terms of giving a discrete trial, or did they prompt and fade prompts and things like that. But those are the kind of the main ways of doing parent caregiver training. You know, tell, show, do, and behavioral skills training. Premack principle, right? First this, then that. Everyone's familiar with this. That's Premack principle. Preference assessment. Preference assessment is something that we use when we're trying to determine what items might be potential reinforcers. So the easiest way to do a preference assessment, and although it's the most unreliable, easiest but most unreliable, is called ask the caregivers. Asking the caregivers is the easiest way to do a preference assessment for what the kid likes and what are their preferences, what could be possible reinforcers, is just asking the caregiver parent. And by the way, if the kids are verbal, you can ask them too. But again, asking them is the most unreliable way because preferences change. The next most reliable way is just watch, or observe the child and note what they play with. That's the next most reliable way, is to just watch the kid and record, what did they play with. Let's say they, you're watching them on the playground during recess, and he spends, 12 of the 15 minutes of recess on the swings and 3 of the 15 minutes on the jungle gym. Well, his most preferred, based on that observation, is the swings, and the second most preferred is the jungle gym. You could do the same thing with him at home. If you watch him at home and he plays on the iPad for 20 minutes and plays with action figures for 5 minutes, and he plays with Legos for 0 minutes, well, then you have kind of a hierarchy of what is most preferred, second most preferred, and least preferred toys are. And so that's the second most, and that's probably the most common way we do preference assessments. There are a few other ways that are a little more detailed. I don't think you're going to need to know about them for the BCAT test. I will mention them just so you're familiar with them, but they're called paired stimulus, and that's where you put 2 reinforcers. You kind of pit 2 reinforcers against one another, and you say, which one do you want to play with? You can only choose one, and you just note which one the kid chose, and then you pair that with other ones and see, okay, when I've paired them, which one was chosen the most, which one was chosen the second most, which one was chosen the third most, etc., etc. And that's called a paired stimulus. But I don't think the BCAT's going to ask you about those levels. You'll probably just need to know what a preference assessment is, and it's just a methodology for determining what the kid's preferred items are, because those items are going to be used for reinforcement. A prompt, I think at this point you guys should all know what prompts are. They're anything we do to help the child get the correct response. So common types of prompts are hand-over-hand prompts, model prompts, point prompts, tap prompts, position prompts, verbal prompts. I'm probably missing a few, but they're basically things we do to get a correct response. All prompts need to be faded. That's going to be in caps. As soon as possible. All prompts need to be faded as soon as possible to avoid prompt dependency. So make sure that if any prompting you're using, those are being faded as soon as possible. There's a couple of different, and that's number 14, so now we've covered that one. Number 11, 12, and 13, well, there's 3 different prompting methods. Let's talk about the first one, errorless learning. Errorless learning is where you prompt right away. You don't wait for the kid to get 2 incorrects before prompting. That's a different method called error correction. Errorless learning is where you don't want the kid to make any errors, so on the very first trial, you prompt them right out of the gates, right off the get-go. And you fade your prompts and fade your prompts and fade your prompts until the kid's doing it independently. But you don't even give them a chance to get an incorrect response during errorless learning. Generally, errorless learning is used when a kid has no clue this new thing you're asking them to do, right? Like when you're first teaching a new skill. Like I was saying, touch Achilles tendon, right? You have no reason to expect that the kid knows what errorless learning or what an Achilles tendon is. And so you might use errorless learning to prompt the child to touch that part of their body. And then you fade that prompt and fade that prompt and fade that prompt until the kid's touching their Achilles tendon when you say, touch Achilles tendon. So usually errorless learning is used when you're teaching brand new skills that the kid hasn't learned yet. In contrast, error correction is where you wait 2 incorrect responses before you prompt. That's probably the one you guys might be a little more familiar with. It's basically where you say, touch nose, and if they don't do it, say, nope, try again, touch nose, nope, they don't do it. Now this third time you're going to now prompt. You say, okay, touch nose, and then you do a hand-over-hand prompt or something like that. That's error correction. So that's in contrast to errorless learning. When you do error correction, there's actually 2 subtypes. One's called most to least prompting, and one's called least to most prompting. And these are basically exactly what they sound like. Most to least prompting, you start with the most intrusive prompt possible, and then you fade down to the least intrusive prompt possible. So basically, the most intrusive prompt means the most of your effort, and then you fade and fade your effort and fade your effort until it's very little of your effort, and then in fact until you fade it completely and it's independent for the child. That's most to least prompting. So that might be like if you were saying touch nose and the kid got it wrong twice in a row. And so on the third trial you say touch nose and then you do a full hand over hand prompt. And then the next trial you say touch nose and you do like a partial hand over hand prompt. And then on the next trial you say touch nose and you do a minimal hand over hand prompt. And on the next trial you say touch nose and maybe you just model prompt it. And on the next trial you don't do a prompt, right? You faded it completely. That would be most to least prompting. Least to most prompting, on the other hand, is you start with the minimum prompting, because if you don't have to go full bore, why go full bore, right? The idea of least to most prompting is do the least amount of your effort as possible because it's less for you to fade and you don't want the child to become prompt dependent. And at different times I may use most to least and least to most. Usually I'll use most to least if I really don't want the kid to get an incorrect response on the next trial. If I really want them to be successful and be told, yay, good job, I'll do a most to least type of approach because I just have to guarantee success, or else the kid, I think, is going to get frustrated. Whereas if I feel like I can push it a little bit with the kid and the kid's got some gumption and probably won't have a meltdown if he gets it wrong again, I might be willing to use a least to most method to let the kid be as independent as possible. Prompt fading, we already talked about that. There's another type of prompt that's not used that often, I find. Number 15, time delay prompt. This is where you give the SD and then there's a time delay between the SD and the prompt. So imagine let's say you're doing the index cards and you're doing the red versus blue, right? And you say, touch blue. And the kid got it wrong twice in a row. So you're planning on using a prompt on the next trial. But you want to give the kid at least a little bit of time before you prompt it. You might say, touch blue, and then you're counting in your head, 1, 2, 3. And if they still haven't responded, like let's say they were doing a non-response, then you go ahead and do whatever prompt you were going to do. Let's say a point prompt or a tap prompt or a hand-over-hand prompt or something like that. And then you do that time delay again. So you say, touch blue, 1, 2, 3, and then you prompt them. You're basically using this time delay to give the kid a chance to do it on their own. But if they don't do it on their own within that time delay, you go ahead and prompt them. And then the way you fade up time delay is just by shortening it. You go, instead of going 3 seconds, when you're fading a time delay, you just go 2 seconds. So you go, touch blue, and then in your head you're counting 1, 2, and then you prompt. Something like that. And you can use that with activities like teaching colors or teaching body parts. You can do it with, like verbal programs like, what's your address? And you're going to tell them the name of their address, but you can wait a couple of seconds because you want to give them a chance to say it on their own. So time delay is used once in a while. I don't see it used that often. Usually we're prompting pretty immediately. So just so you're familiar, there is something called a time delay prompt, and that's what it is. All right. Chaining. Chaining is a procedure whereby this is usually used with like self-help skills. I think most of you will be familiar with this. This is where you break down a skill into different small steps and then teach those steps one step at a time. So like each step is the link in the chain, and then when you put all the steps together, when you combine all the steps, you have the whole chain of behaviors that makes the skill. So like brushing teeth has a lot of little steps, like get toothbrush, get toothpaste, open toothbrush or open toothpaste, squeeze toothpaste on a toothbrush, etc., until, you know, rinse the toothbrush, put the toothbrush away, you know. So chaining is a methodology where you break a skill down into smaller steps because it's going to be easier to teach those like small steps rather than to try to teach it as one big long chain. And there's 3 different methods of chaining that I do want you to be familiar with, because I think the BCAT will probably ask you about these 3. One is called forward chaining. So forward chaining. The other one's called backward chaining. And the other one is called, the third one is called total task chaining. And in forward chaining, you teach those small steps from first step to last step. So in forward chaining, teach the steps from first to last. In backward chaining, you teach the steps from last to first. And in total task chaining, you teach the steps that the child can't do simultaneously, like all at the same time. So, for example, in brush teeth, if you're doing forward chaining, you would first teach them how to, how to get the toothbrush, how to get the toothpaste, and you wouldn't teach them yet how to actually brush, or you wouldn't teach them yet how to squeeze the toothpaste onto the toothbrush until they've got the first step down. Once they got the first step down, then you would teach them the second step, which is how to squeeze the toothpaste onto the toothbrush. But you wouldn't teach them the third step, which is how to rinse the put a little water on the toothbrush, right? And so on and so forth. And you basically move forward from first step to last step in your teaching process. Backward chaining is the opposite. You do all of the steps for the child except for the last step. So putting the toothbrush away back in the little toothbrush holder, that's the last step. That's the one you actually teach the child to do. Once they can do the last step, now you do all the steps for the child except the last 2. So now you teach them to rinse the toothbrush and put the toothbrush away in the toothbrush holder. And once they can do the last 2 steps, you move backwards, and now you do all the steps except for the last 3, and so on and so forth until the child's doing all of the steps. In total task chaining, you basically look and see which steps the child cannot do, and you teach those steps simultaneously. So if the kid can't do, and this is usually better to do if there's only a few steps the kid cannot do. So let's use a different example. Let's use putting on a T-shirt as an example for total task chaining. Let's say the child already can pull the shirt down over their body, and they can already put the shirt over their head, but they can't get their left arm through or their right arm through. Total task chaining would mean you teach them how to do their left arm and their right arm through, and you just teach those simultaneously. So those are your types of chaining: backward, forward, and total task chaining. Forward is from first to last step, backward is from last to first step, and total task chaining is all steps simultaneously, or all steps that the child can't do simultaneously. You may not need to have that level of detail for the BCAT exam, but you have it just in case. Shaping. Shaping is a process of using differential reinforcement so that the kid's behavior, it gets even more refined and more refined and more refined. So for example, when I'm teaching a kid to mand for water, probably the first time they mand for water, they don't say, "I would like water, please." Most likely they say something like this, "Water," or something like, that's not very articulated very clearly. So that's fine. If that's our starting point, we're going to go ahead and reinforce when the kid says, "Water." But eventually we want that to be more clearly articulated, so we're going to use a shaping procedure. The shaping procedure goes like this. once we've decided that the kid can say water, we're going to say, okay, now we're going to raise the criteria. Now you need to say water. And if you don't say it clearly, we're not going to reinforce you with water. So now when the kid says water, they get reinforced. But when the kid says water, they don't get reinforced. What happens over time, assuming the kid's deprived of water, and water is a reinforcer, over time the kid learns to articulate water clearly because they want the water. And they stop saying water because that is put on extinction. And so basically what you've done is you've shaped the behavior from water to water. And then you can raise the criterion eventually again from them saying water to saying want water. And now only when they say want water do they get reinforced. And if they just say water, they don't get reinforced. And eventually you raise the criterion again, and now they have to say I want water to get reinforced. And so on and so forth until you get to whatever the final goal is, which might be like, I want water, please, while they're making eye contact with you or something like that. And all you're using is differential reinforcement, which is putting one behavior on extinction and reinforcing a different behavior. In this case, the behavior you're putting on extinction is the lower criterion, and the behavior you're reinforcing is the new or the higher criterion. Okay? And so over time, what happens is, the kid learns to do it the better criterion, the higher criterion, and you shape their behavior to be better and better and better. This also works when you're shaping the child to stop doing problem behaviors and start doing a replacement behavior. So let's say the kid tantrums to get cookie, and you want them to say, cookie, please. Well, tantrum should be put on extinction, and saying cookie, please should be differentially reinforced. And over time, you're going to shape their behavior. If they want the cookie, they're going to stop saying or stop tantruming, and they're going to start saying cookie, please. So that's basically how shaping works. Pacing, we talked about pacing with kind of keeping your pace. Especially if you're doing fluency training, you want to keep your pace fast. Now, obviously, if the kid is learning something and it's novel to them, it's new to them, they're learning it for the first time, you don't want to go super fast because you're going to leave the kid behind in the dust. But sometimes if you're going too slow for the kid can get distracted, right? If you're working with a kid with autism and you're going too slow to record your data or something like that, the kid's going to look out the window or start hand flapping, or he's going to fill his boredom or her boredom with something. So pacing becomes kind of like dancing in a way, that when you're, metaphorically, when you're dancing with your child, doing these trials and working with your child, you need to match your pace to whatever pace they need. If they need a slower pace, you need to move at a slower pace. If they need a faster pace, you need to move at a faster pace. So that's the idea of pacing. 19, alternative and augmentative communication. So many of our children don't speak. And so their form of communication is like an iPad. They've got a bunch of different apps on their iPad that they can talk with, like Proloquo, or, maybe like they use PECs, right? PECs is probably the most common example of alternative communication. So I think the BCAT is just going to want you to be familiar with what are some different ways that kids can communicate besides vocally. And that could be like sign language. I mean, even gestures could be technically an alternative form of communication. The kids could pull the parent's hand, into the kitchen and towards the refrigerator. But the most common ones that you're probably familiar with are going to be like PECs, or maybe like an app on the iPad or something like that. Number 20, functional approaches to teaching language skills. So the idea is that all behavior, including problem behavior, serves a function. When a kid tantrums, that behavior is communicating something, right? The kid is communicating that I'm not happy that you denied me access, or the tantrum is communicating that I'm not happy that you told me to eat my Brussels sprouts, or whatever it is. I'm not happy that you're ignoring me. All behavior, including problem behavior, is communicating something. It all serves a function. So the idea is if we're trying to replace a problem behavior with an appropriate form of communication, we need to understand the function of that problem behavior first before we can decide on what the replacement behavior should be. For example, if we learn that the problem behavior of tantruming is functioning to get escape from non-preferred tasks, then teaching him to demand for more cookie isn't going to help him. Because in that moment, it's not about getting more cookies, it's about getting out of the task and getting a break. So we have to understand the function before we teach them language skills. And if you remember during your ABA workshop, there was 4 or 5 different types of communication. We call them verbal operants, right? There's demand. These are requests. So mands serve the function of requesting things that they want, right? There's the tact. That serves the function of labeling things. There's the intraverbal. That serves the function of answering questions or commenting. There's the echoic. That serves the function of imitation, or specifically verbal imitation. Man, tact, echoic, intraverbal. Yeah, those are probably the 4 types of things you went over. So each of those serves, each of those approaches, or those types of communications, or each of those types of language, or each of those types of verbal operants each serve a different function. And so you should be familiar with the mand, the tact, the intraverbal, and the echoic. Because I'm guessing the BCAT exam will probably reference them somewhere. And that kind of covers, 21, 22, 23, and 24. Man training is to teach the kid to request. Tact training is to teach them to label things, which is usually to develop their vocabulary. Echoic training is to teach them to verbally imitate, and intraverbal training is to teach them to answer questions or to make comments. Joint attention is where you teach a child and another person, oftentimes a therapist, to jointly, or at the same time, right? Attend to the same activity. So we both play a game together, or we both are doing a puzzle together. Those are ways of getting social interaction, is by having a peer and the kid jointly attending to the same activity. It may also be a way a child solicits attention in an appropriate way. So let's say the child says, "Look, Mom, I finished my drawing," and then he shows the drawing to the parent. Well, now the parent and the child are jointly attending to that drawing, and that's a way the child was able to solicit the parent's attention to his accomplishment. So that's another way that joint attention can be a replacement behavior to attention-seeking problem behaviors, because joint attention solicits another person's attention to join you, right? To join the child. Teaching play skills, again, this is, we do this primarily through role-playing and through imitation drills. So we say, okay, make the car zoom along the racetrack, and then we push a car along the racetrack, and the kid then pushes the car along the racetrack, or something like that. So we do a lot of our play skill programs as like role play or using modeling to teach the kid. Motor skills, we use a lot of imitation drills, right? We say, do this, and then we clap our hands, or do this, and we touch our nose. That's a way we teach motor skills. Teaching cognition skills, these are going to be like thinking skills, so that would really get back into what I was talking about way earlier in the day when I was talking about teaching perspective taking. There's a bunch of drills called theory of mind drills that we do, and I'm not going to go into the details on them now, but you basically teach the child to take perspective and do things like that. I'm not sure how many questions the BCAT is going to ask on cognition skills, because cognition or thinking is not directly observable, because thinking occurs inside the mind, and because it's not directly observable, it's sort of outside the purview of ABA, because we can't see when the child's thinking. Obviously, we can see if they're looking up left, upper left corner of their eyes, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're thinking. So I'm not quite sure how the BCAT exam is going to be testing for, an understanding of how you teach cognition skills. So I just wanted to familiarize you guys with, something called theory of mind, which is perspective taking, And there's a bunch of theory of mind exercises that we can use to teach a kid to take perspective. Teaching social skills, we do that oftentimes through role play or through social stories. Sometimes we do that at play groups. We have individual goals set up for the kiddo on their social skill. That social skill may be eye contact during a conversation. That social skill may be greetings. That social skill may be, sharing or, inviting a peer to play, or something like that, maintaining a conversation. There's a number of different ways to teach social skills. You can do it through DTT methodologies where you're drilling the kid on the social skill. You can do it through like a natural environment training like PRT where you're setting up natural opportunities for the social skill to be practiced. There's a number of different ways. I skipped that one. Executive function. I'm just going to talk quickly about what executive functioning is. Executive functioning is our ability to plan multi-step activities. So if I was going to plan a picnic at the beach, I need to be able to plan several different elements, like how am I going to get there? What do I need to take? What's the weather going to be like? Do I need an umbrella? So the executive functioning part of the brain is, if you really want to know, it's in the prefrontal cortex. And I don't think they're going to ask for that, but that part of the brain is used for planning multi-step activities. So on a very simple level, let's say a kid with autism sees that their iPad is on a shelf, but they can't reach it. If they have decent executive functioning, they may see the dining room chair, pull the dining room chair over to the cabinet, stand on the dining room, or climb up the dining room chair, reach up to the shelf, and get the iPad. That would be like a 5-step activity, which is basically problem solving, right? Which is actually great. So executive functioning has to do with planning and problem solving and things like that. Teaching academic skills. You just teach academic skills the way you teach any other skill. You can do it via drill-based methodologies, or you can do it via natural environment training. Most of the time, we don't teach academic skills because we're not in the school setting, but if we do, you can do it through any of the methodologies we've already talked about. Visual supports. Visual supports have to do with, just like visual schedules, things like that. And let's see, what else? That's probably the main way. I mean, obviously that's the most common one, is like visual supports would be like a visual schedule, like a bunch of, maybe like a picture schedule, but it can be written out as well. Curriculum modification. This really has to do with data, and I know we're running a little bit late here, so just bear with me. Curriculum modification really is going to be done by the supervisor, not really by the direct staff, but the data is what tells us when we need to modify our curriculum. If we're seeing a plateau and the kid is not improving, that data is telling us we need to change how we're doing this because it's not working. Or maybe we need to change the curriculum to try something easier. Maybe the kid is lacking a foundational skill. And so we may modify the curriculum because the data is telling us, hey, it's not working, or even worse, the kid's regressing. Now, obviously, in an ideal world, the kid is progressing, and he's progressing nicely, and the data is telling us, yeah, move to the next goal, move the curriculum up. So that's really what curriculum development modification has to do with. All right, kind of coming down to the wire. Jesus, there's a lot. All right, behavior intervention plan. If you guys have to go, it's about 12 o'clock now. If you guys have to go, that's fine. If you can stay on, I would highly encourage you guys to stay on. It's going to take me a while to get to the next couple of pages, but I will make this PowerPoint, or not PowerPoint, this webinar available to everyone when it's all said and done. So I understand that it was scheduled till 12 o'clock today, so some of you may have other plans. For those of you who can stay on, I'd encourage you to do so that you can ask questions. I'm going to keep going at this point, though. Treatment behavior intervention plan. So the BIP, or the behavior intervention plan, is basically, the techniques that we're going to be using. It was designed by the BCBA and maybe the middle tier staff as well, but it's a plan to reduce the problem behavior and increase the skill acquisition behaviors. So it can involve a lot of different things, like a lot of different techniques like priming, antecedent interventions, like environmental rearrangements. It can involve consequential interventions like extinction and differential reinforcement, a bunch of different things. So basically it's going to be, the BIP is going to be designed by the BCBA and or the middle tier staff, and then it'll be implemented by the direct staff and the parents to reduce problem behavior and increase skill acquisition behaviors. The target behavior is whatever the goal is, whatever the skill that you're trying to teach is. So if the target behavior is reducing hitting, that's the target behavior. A target behavior can also be a skill acquisition behavior, like the target behavior could be, teaching the color blue. Operational definition in this context, and by the way, let me just clarify, in this context, the target behavior is the problem behavior. The operational definition is whatever the the description of what the behavior looks like. So let's say we said the target behavior was eloping. The operational definition of eloping might be anytime Johnny moves more than 10 feet away without permission. That would be the operational definition. The FBA, the functional behavior assessment, is the assessment done by the BCBA, although it may also have been done by a middle tier staff, a QAS professional, that basically defined what are the problem behaviors, what are the operational definitions, how often the problem behaviors are happening, what function the problem behavior serves, and what the behavior intervention plan will be. That's like the whole assessment that we do when we first get a kiddo. Now, we are constantly assessing if new behaviors come up, so functional behavior assessment can really be done at any time, but generally it's done in the beginning. We already talked about the 4 functions: escape, attention, access, and automatic, so I'm not going to go over those again. I'll just jump right to number 9 on this list, antecedent interventions. Yeah, Rochelle, that's fine. I'm going to be emailing out everyone the recording. So I've been recording since probably like 18 minutes into the webinar. I forgot to hit record at the very, very beginning. So maybe what I'll do is I'll go over the first, page of autism stuff, or maybe the first half a page at the end, and then include that in the recording. So that way it'll be available to all you guys. So yeah, thank you for asking. Thank you for your participation too. Antecedent interventions. So there's a number of different antecedent interventions. The main ones are going to be things like environmental rearrangements. You're welcome. Environmental rearrangements are things like, let's say the kid engages in the problem behavior when his sibling, or with a certain classmate. Let's say, 2 classmates are really antagonistic with one another. A simple environmental rearrangement would be just to sit them apart from one another. If our kiddo with autism, hits his own head when mom vacuums, a very simple environmental rearrangement would be to tell mom or teach mom only vacuum when the kid's at school, or do something like that. Another environmental rearrangement, if a kid elopes, is that we sit between him and the doorway so that he can't elope very far. Another antecedent intervention besides environmental rearrangements would be priming. Priming is where you let the kid know ahead of time what are the expectations. So you might say, okay, first we're going to do, tying shoes. Then we're going to do, then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to do vocabulary. Or you could show them the picture schedule. If you have a visual support for him, you could show them the picture schedule. Say, first we're going to do shoe tying, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do that, blah, 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 blah. Or another way of doing priming, is like, okay, in a few minutes we're going to turn off the iPad. That way you're letting them know ahead of time that, 1 minute, okay, in 30 seconds we're going to turn off the iPad. Okay, in 10 seconds we're going to turn off the iPad. That's another example of priming. Behavioral momentum which is also called the high P request sequence, which is actually number 12. I'll go ahead and talk about it now because it's another type of antecedent intervention, is where you do a bunch of easy tasks. Oftentimes these are tasks that the kid likes, or if they don't like it, at least it's neutral to the kid because it's really easy for the kid. So behavioral momentum would be like, let's say the kid is really good with imitation. And so what you really want them to do is, pick up a toy they threw. And so you say, okay, do this, and then you clap and they clap. Do this, you touch their nose and they touch their nose. Do this, you touch their head and they touch their head. And each time they're complying with you, you reinforce them really like enthusiastically. Yeah, all right, way to go. And then once you've sort of built up this momentum of compliance, you throw in the task that you actually wanted them to do, which is in this case the cleaning up their toy. So it might look something like this. Touch nose, good job. Touch head, way to go. Touch ears, nice. Pick up that toy. And you kind of do it with that same sort of rhythm and cadence and enthusiasm. And because you've been reinforcing them, they've sort of in this momentum of complying. Kids who are complying, they tend to keep complying. Now, it doesn't work every time, but it's another antecedent intervention that you can use to help with non-compliance. Another antecedent intervention is offering choices. So let's say you have, you want the kid to work on shoe tying, so you can give them a choice. You can say, well, do you want to put on your red shoes or your white shoes? That's another way of offering choices. You can also offer choices of, do you want to first do shoe tying or first do you want to do math homework? That's another way of offering them choices between two non-preferred activities. So offering choices can put the locus of control within the child, or at least they believe they're in control, and that can get better compliance as well. So those are all some antecedent interventions that may be used. Token economy. Some of you may be familiar with a token economy. Token economy is where the kid is earning tokens, and then for doing certain behaviors, almost like money. And then the tokens can be exchanged for backup reinforcers, and the backup reinforcers are the things the kid actually wants. So maybe they have like a chore chart, and every time they finish a chore, they get a token. And when they have enough tokens, they can exchange those tokens for, I don't know, an ice cream or a trip to the movies or something like that. That's basically how a token system works. I already described behavioral momentum, but it's also called the high P, which stands for high probability request sequence. So you may see that on the BCAT exam. If it says high P, that means high probability, because the first behaviors that you do, like those easy behaviors, are high. There's a high probability that you're going to get compliance with them. So when you say touch nose, touch head, touch ears, those are all the high probability behaviors. And then you say pick up that toy. That's the low probability behavior. So that's why it's called the high P, or high probability request sequence. Non-contingent reinforcement is when you are giving the child some functional reinforcer on a fixed time schedule. So I know I said a lot of things there. Let's talk about that. So let's say the kid engages in attention-seeking behaviors from mom. Well, one way of making it unnecessary for him to engage in attention-seeking behaviors is just to have mom give him attention on a regular schedule, because then there's no need to engage in attention-seeking behaviors, because essentially what's happening is if mom gives him attention on a regular schedule, it's going to satiate. Remember that term that we talked about earlier? It's going to be satiation, right? It's going to abolish or destroy the motivation to engage in the attention-seeking behavior because he's getting the attention from mom on a regular schedule. And that schedule is usually some kind of fixed time schedule, like every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes, something like that. So non-contingent reinforcement is an intervention, and it's an antecedent intervention that can be used to abolish or satiate, the motivation to engage in a problem behavior, because you're providing that reinforcement non-contingently. That means the kid did not have to do any correct response in order to get that attention if that was the reinforcer, right? So, basically all that has to happen is time has to pass. When 5 minutes has passed, mom gives them attention. Or if you don't want to use the attention example, you could give them a break from tasks. So let's say the kid was engaging in escape behaviors, and to make it unnecessary for him to engage in some kind of tantrum to get escape, you could just give him an escape from tasks every 5 minutes, whether the kid had been doing a good job and got the homework done or not getting the homework done. You could just give him breaks every 2 minutes if you need to. And the idea is that, again, because the breaks are coming on a regular schedule, there's no need to engage in the problem behavior of tantruming. And so basically you've satiated the need, right? You've abolished the motivation to engage in problem behavior. So that's non-contingent reinforcement. Replacement behavior. We've talked about what the replacement behavior is already, so I'm just going to gloss over it. The replacement behavior is the thing that you'd rather have the child do instead of the problem behavior. And if they do this other behavior, this replacement behavior, you're going to give them the reinforcer. You're going to allow them, let's say they manned for a break, and that's the replacement behavior to tantruming. If they man for a break, you're going to give them a break, which is if the reinforcer is escape, you give them that break. If they manned for one more cookie, please, then you should give them that one more cookie. Now, in that case, there may be a problem with that because eventually the kid's going to have like 6 billion cookies, and that's not good for the kid. If they say, excuse me, Mom, and that's the replacement behavior for nagging, Mom has to give that kid attention. Even if the attention is to say something like, hey, I heard you say excuse me, thank you so much, Mommy's on the phone, I'll be with you in 30 seconds. The replacement behavior must serve the same function. The replacement behavior must serve the same function as the problem behavior. I'm typing it, but it's not going on there. The replacement behavior must serve the same function as the problem behavior. Because if it doesn't serve the same function as the problem behavior, why is the child going to do the replacement behavior? They're just going to revert back to the problem behavior. Like I said, if Mom put saying excuse me on extinction, the kid's going to revert back to nagging. 15. Escape extinction. This is where it's just a fancy term for following through, right? You're putting escape behaviors on extinction. So in other words, follow through. Attention extinction, we already talked about that. That's planned ignoring. Access to tangible extinction, well, that means continuing to deny access. Extinction burst. This is when the behavior is first put on extinction, meaning when the reinforcer that was responsible for maintaining that problem behavior starts being withheld. At first, the kid is like, hey, what's going on here? Why is this not working anymore? And they actually try harder, meaning they do more problem behavior for a short period of time to get that reinforcer back. They burst in terms of the rate or the frequency or the intensity of that problem behavior. It gets worse before it gets better. And so we need to be aware of and prepare for that extinction burst. Because the worst thing we want to do is not prepare ourselves or our parents that we're working with for that extinction burst. And then that extinction burst comes, and the parent or you yourselves will go, oh my God, it's getting worse. Okay, here, you can have escape. Or okay, you can have a cookie. Or here's my attention. Because now all you've taught the child is be even worse, and that will work to get the reinforcer. So you have to be ready for that extinction burst because it's going to come. Continuous reinforcement, all that means is reinforcing every time the child does the correct response. So let's say you say touch nose, the kid touches their nose, yay, good job. And they do it again, touch nose, and the kid touches their nose again, yay, good job. You're reinforcing every single time the kid gets a correct response. That's a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Sometimes it's also called a fixed ratio 1. Whoops. Or FR1. So you may see that term used, fixed ratio 1 or FR1 maybe, and that just means you reinforce every single time. Intermittent reinforcement means you don't reinforce every time. It means you just reinforce sometimes. So sometimes that's called a variable ratio or a variable schedule of reinforcement. And that might mean, let's say they're doing a page of math problems, and instead of reinforcing them after every single correct math problem, you reinforce them after a few math problems. And then a few more correct math problems, you reinforce them again. It's intermittent. Usually you do continuous reinforcement when you're first teaching a skill, and then you'll use intermittent reinforcement after the skill has been learned pretty well and you're trying to maintain the skill. We've talked about differential reinforcement, but let me talk more specifically here, since the next 3 are 3 different types of differential reinforcement. You've got DRA, or differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. All that means is that the replacement behavior is an alternative to the problem behavior. And I'm going to talk in a minute what an alternative versus incompatible means. And then DRI, differential reinforcement of incompatible, is basically the same thing, except the replacement behavior is incompatible with the problem behavior. So let me talk what alternative and incompatible means. Alternative means the replacement behavior and the problem behavior could be done simultaneously. So alternative means the replacement behavior and the problem behavior could be done simultaneously. For example, the kid could say excuse me and simultaneously pull on mom's clothing. They could be done at the same time. Therefore, saying excuse me is an alternative to the problem behavior of pulling on mom's clothing. In contrast, incompatible means the problem behavior cannot be done simultaneously as the replacement behavior. Incompatible means the problem behavior cannot be done simultaneously as the problem behavior. So for example, if the problem behavior is biting to get access to, or to get escape, then the replacement behavior of saying, I want a break please, is incompatible with biting, because if the kid is biting you, they can't also simultaneously say, I want break please, because obviously their mouth is full of your arm. And so they couldn't possibly say it simultaneously. So that's the difference between DRA and DRI. In DRA, the replacement behavior could be done simultaneously as the problem behavior. In DRI, the replacement behavior cannot physically be done at the same time as the problem behavior. The third one here, number 23, is DRO. DRO stands for differential reinforcement of other behavior, and basically what you're reinforcing is during a certain period of time, let's say, and it doesn't have to be 10 minutes, but I'll just use that example. During 10 minutes, any behavior other than the problem behavior occurs. So if the problem behavior is biting, and during that 10 minutes, any other behavior occurs except for biting, the kid gets reinforced. A lot of people, when they think about DRO, they basically think about it as the absence of the problem behavior for that time period. So a lot of times they'll say DRO equals the absence of the problem behavior during that time period. So let's say it's a 10-minute DRO. They say, okay, as long as no biting occurs during the 10 minutes, the kid gets reinforced at the end of that 10-minute period. So that's what DRO is. If the kid does bite, then they don't get reinforced, and you actually start the 10-minute timer over. And it doesn't have to be 10 minutes. I just use that as an example. It could be 5 minutes. It could be 20 minutes. It could be an hour. Whatever. Number 24, response blocking. We already talked about this, but this is when like a problem behavior is about to happen, and you know it's about to happen either because you see some precursor behaviors to it, and you basically block it. So imagine the kid was, eats inedible objects. Some people call it, is diagnosed with pica, let's say, and you see them going over to that inedible object, picking it up off the ground, and they're bringing their hand to their mouth. Well, that's enough precursor behaviors for you to know what's coming next. And so you, in all your swiftness, speed over there to the kid and prompt their hands down. You're response blocking that. The kid's trying to elope, and you blocked them from eloping. You're response blocking. Redirection, kind of the same thing as response blocking, except the problem behaviors has already started to occur. So let's say the kid already starts hand flapping, and then you prompt their hands down. That's redirecting them. Let's say they already started eloping, and you say, come back in here, come back in the room. That could be a redirection. Overcorrection, we already talked about that. Overcorrection, the example was given by one of the participants of this webinar. That is like, let's say the kid fails to say hello after being told, hi, Johnny. And so as overcorrection, you make him say hello 10 times. You can use overcorrection like when I was a kid. I broke a window because I was throwing a rock. And the overcorrection was my parents made me write 100 times, I will not throw rocks. Right? Basically what overcorrection is you're having the child do some extra effort to overcorrect the infraction, to overcorrect the problem behavior. Response cost. This is where you take something away as a result of some problem behavior or some infraction. So let's say the kid hit his sister, and you take away a token. That would be a response cost. You could take away a toy or something like that too. So those are examples of response costs. Timeout, we already talked about that earlier, but that's where you would put the kid kind of quote-unquote in solitary. Maybe it's in their room, maybe it's in a separate room. Kind of the old school way of doing it is like putting them in a stool facing the corner. It's like the dunce chair, right? Generally, when we do timeout, we try to do it in another room so that they don't have access to all the fun stuff that's in the time-in environment. And for timeout to work, you really have to make sure that the timeout room is no fun at all, and the time-in environment is a lot of fun. Because if the timeout room has all his toys in it, that's not going to be very effective. Spontaneous recovery. Spontaneous recovery is something that happens when a behavior has been put on extinction, and you've gone through the extinction burst, and the behavior's decreased. What usually happens is that sometime later, and this can be days later or even weeks later, the behavior kind of rears its ugly head again, and it just kind of pops up almost out of nowhere. And the reason it's important to be aware of spontaneous recovery is because it catches people off guard. Because you kind of think, oh, I thought I was past that. I thought we were past this behavior. I thought he's no longer doing this tantrum to get escape. So spontaneous recovery is like a little bit of a recovery in the behavior, days or sometimes weeks after the behavior has gone on extinction. And you just want to be aware of it so that it doesn't catch you off guard. All right, data collection. This is really important, and I don't know how much depth the BCAT's going to go into, so I'm just going to kind of give you what I think. There are different ways of measuring a behavior. So let's say a kid tantrums, and in your session, you could count the number of times the kid tantrum. That's called event recording. And you can actually see that below on the next number 2. And basically, the type of data that event recording gives you is called rate. So number of tantrums per session is your rate per session. So let's say you could count the number of tantrums by doing event recording, and that gives you a rate of 3 times per session, or if maybe it was per hour, 3 times per hour, or something like that. That's one way of collecting data on the tantrum, right? Another way of collecting data on the tantrum is, the duration. How long, on average, is each of his tantrums? So let's say the first tantrum, you do a procedure called timing, which is also on number 2. And you find that the first tantrum is 12 minutes long, the second tantrum is 13 minutes long, and the third tantrum is 14 minutes long. And so on average, his tantrums are 13 minutes long. So it has an average duration of 13 minutes. That's another way of collecting data on the tantrum. Another possibility is you get the percentage. This is my favorite way of getting data on the tantrums, especially if the tantrum is serving an escape function or an access function. So let's say you deny him access during that session 10 times, and he tantrums 3 times. Well, that means if you're looking at the percentage of times, or the percentage of opportunities that he had to tantrum was actually 10, because you denied him access 10 times. Each time you denied him access, that was an opportunity that he could tantrum. But he's doing really well, and he only tantrumed 3 out of those 10 times, or 30% of the time he was denied access, he tantrumed. That really paints a different picture than just saying he tantrumed 3 times per session, which is your rate, right? To me, when I hear that he tantrumed 3 times per session, I think, wow, that's not very good. But when I realize, whoa, wait a minute, those 3 times per session was actually only 30% of the time he was denied access, I'm actually kind of impressed. So each of these data measurement systems, or these data measurement dimensions, paints a slightly different picture of the behavior. And actually, a more correct way of saying that is each of these measurement dimensions shows you a different dimension or a different aspect of that behavior, or a different characteristic of that behavior. One of those dimensions shows you the rate characteristic. One of those dimensions shows you the duration characteristic. And then another dimension shows you the percent of opportunities characteristic of that behavior of tantruming. Which one you choose, really, that's probably not going to be up to you guys as direct staff. It's probably going to be a decision that's made by the BCBA, and I'm fairly certain that the BCAT exam is not going to ask you to understand when you would choose percentage over rate over duration. So I'm going to leave it at that. And then time sampling is another method or procedure you can use to get percentage data. But instead of percent of opportunities, it gives you what's called percent of intervals. But I don't think that's super important either. Skill acquisition data is just the data we collect on the goals that we're trying to teach the child to do, right? If we're trying to teach him to give eye contact when we call his name, the data we collect on that goal is the skill acquisition data. The data we collect on the problem behaviors, oftentimes we're trying to reduce these problem behaviors. Sometimes we call it the behavior reduction data. But that's the behavior we collect on the problem behaviors. We graph all of our data because that allows us to look at it and do a visual analysis of the data to see if it's improving or regressing. Inter-observer agreement, or IOA. IOA is when you have 2 observers watching the child at the same time, but they need to be independent of one another. They can't be like standing next to each other and looking over at each other's data sheets, because then they're not independent. The idea would be that these 2 observers are probably on opposite sides of the room, watching the child and collecting data on how the child is doing. So taking data on, let's say, how many times the child tantrumed per session, or what percentage of the time that he was denied access that he tantrumed, or something like that, or how long of a duration the child tantrum for. And what you're looking for is agreement between these two independent observers. If you have high levels of agreement between these two independent observers, then the data that was collected is very trustworthy. Imagine you had two independent observers who was recording the duration of a tantrum, and both of them got 12 minutes. To me, that means that that data is very trustworthy. But let's say you had two independent observers, and one of them got 12 minutes, and one of them got 10 minutes. Now, neither of their data is trustworthy because you don't know which one of them underreported it or which one overreported it. So what you're looking for is a high level of inter-observer agreement in order for us to trust data. Now, the question might be, why do we need to trust the data? Well, as I said earlier when we talked about curriculum modifications, the data tells us what to do. The data tells us when to change our intervention if it's not working and we need to tweak it in some way, or the data tells us what to do if our intervention is working great and we need to up to the new goal. But our data has to be trustworthy before we make a decision about this child's life. So it's really important for us to have trustworthy data. And so oftentimes what will happen is when the supervisor or the middle tier staff goes to the house, some, not all, some of the data the direct staff collects will have inter-observer data collected on by the middle tier or the supervisor, and then the supervisor will say, hey, let me see your data, I want to check it to see how close it is to mine. What they're doing there is asking, or they're looking to see is our data trustworthy? And if it's not, then that may mean a couple of things, like maybe the direct staff needs more training, maybe the supervisor needs more training, I don't know. Maybe the behavioral operational definition is too complex and people are getting confused on when to count, a behavior versus not count a behavior. There's a number of reasons why you may have low IOA, low inter-observer agreement. But and I don't think you need to know that for the BCAT exam either. But anyway, that's what IOA stands for. It's the degree to which two independent observers, their data is similar or the same, IOA. The degree to which two independent observers' data is the same. All right, coming down to the last section, and then I will bid you guys adieu and wish you guys a wonderful weekend. We have to be ethical, right? No surprise there. We should be aware of both ethical and legal considerations, and so I'm just going to go over a couple of them because there's hundreds and hundreds of them. I'm going to kind of go over the main ones, which are kind of spelled out here, these 6. Safety. We should always be concerned about the safety of the child, the family, other family members, ourselves, if you're a supervisor, obviously our staff. Really, it's the safety of the child and anyone in the environment with the child. Some of our kiddos, unfortunately, have really dangerous behaviors. And our intervention plans, sometimes if they require us to follow through, could put ourselves or the child at risk. If our intervention plan is not working and it's putting ourselves or the child at risk, we need to reconsider whether this is a crucial part of the intervention plan that really needs to be in there. And as a direct staff, if you're concerned about that, you would be able to bring that up to your middle tier supervisor or your BCBA maybe to say, hey, I have a concern and here's why, and see what they think. In the office, when you're actually going to the office, and I'm not sure how many times direct staff you guys get a chance to go to each office, but OSHA, the Occupational Safety Hazard Association, I believe is what it stands for, safety in the office also matters. It's not just safety in the environment of the child's house, which also could be a tricky issue if there's toys on the floor, but safety in our own CPC or our office. If there are boxes stacked up really high, that can be a safety concern for you and other people who work in the office. And it's, as an employee of the company you work for, it is still your responsibility to bring up those safety concerns if you see them. If I see trash, even if I didn't drop that trash, I pick it up because I have pride of ownership in the office I work in. And if I see a safety concern, I'm going to say something. And it's really incumbent upon you guys to take that same level of pride and concern for your fellow staff member safety to kind of say something about that. Number 2, Responding to emergencies. You know, in our line of work, emergencies can take a lot of forms. It could be a behavioral emergency, and if the kid is acting out of control, we have all been trained using CPI, right? On CPI training on how to handle those types of emergencies. But if it's even beyond our training in terms of CPI, we need to dial 911 and call the police. Because if we're not equipped, and we tell the family to do the same, by the way, if they are not equipped to handle that behavior, we need to call the police, because for the child's safety and for the safety of people in the environment, that's the correct response in that moment. I mean, I don't want to see the child arrested. I don't want to see the child handcuffed. I want to let the police know, hey, this kid has autism. Please be careful. You know, he doesn't know what he's doing maybe, but we need to be, like, coming back to that first bullet point, the safety of ourselves and everyone in that environment and the child need to be paramount. Number 3, confidentiality. It is our ethical obligation to hold the patient's medical records and medical information, including their private health information, which could be their name, their address, their phone number, their diagnosis, confidentially. We don't talk about our patient, Johnny Smith, with name to people who aren't on Johnny Smith's case unless we have a release of information. We don't talk to our significant other and give the kids confidential information out to our significant other. That would be a breach of confidentiality, and we would be liable. What else? You know, we don't talk about another family, you know, about family A with family B. Even if family A knows family B. I've had families say, hey, I saw, you know, Johnny Smith's mom at VIP soccer or something like that, and she was saying that you're their new supervisor. You know, how are things going with them? I would usually say to that family, I say, you know, I can't disclose anything. I can't even disclose if I work with this person. Sometimes I'll even be kind of tongue-in-cheek about it and say, I cannot confirm nor deny that they are one of my clients. And then the family usually picks up on my sarcasm and kind of lets it go at that point. But we really need to respect that family's information as being private. Not every family wants the world to know that their kid has autism. Recognition of client abuse. We are all mandated reporters. And as mandated reporters, we need to report suspected. That word is really important. Suspected abuse. We are not in the position of having to determine and prove that child abuse is happening. That is a job of the Child Protective Services caseworkers. Our job is only to report a suspected abuse to Child Protective and Family Services. It's their job to then investigate it. So this is kind of a gray area too, because maybe I personally am not a naturally suspicious person, but maybe the next staff is a very kind of suspicious person. I can't push my suspicions or my morals on that other staff to say, you're being paranoid, just let it go. And similarly, they can't push their morals on me and say, oh, you need to be reporting that. I can't believe you're not reporting that. If I feel like it's suspicious enough that I need to report it, then I'm going to report it. If staff B feels like it's suspicious enough that they need to report it, then they need to report it. It doesn't matter what even your supervisor says. If you suspect it, you should report it. And again, one of the nice things, if you're not sure, maybe you're on the fence about it, one of the great things about the Child and Protective Services service is you can actually call them and say, I'm thinking about reporting something that may have been child abuse, but I'd like to get your opinion. And you tell them what happened, and you can say, is that something that's reportable? And they will tell you over the phone, yeah, that's reportable, let's do a report. Or they'll say, no, that's not something you need to report. And then you say, if they say no, it's not reportable, you say, thank you, can I get your name and, you know, like your employee number, because they have like a special caseworker number. And you document, right? Let me put that in caps. And you document, I spoke on, you know, December 5th I spoke to Child Protective Family Services worker Joanne Thompson, case number or caseworker number 12345, reported my concern about Johnny Smith, and this is of course in our system. You know, Joanne Thompson said that this is not reportable. Now you're covered. You're good, and you're done. And if Joanne told you, yeah, that is reportable, then you go ahead and make the report. Really, whether you end up being told, yes, it's reportable, and you make that report, or whether you're told, no, it's not reportable, and then you document it, it takes the burden off you, and you immediately start feeling better. I've had to do these reports, and I can tell you from experience, it's like a weight being lifted off your chest. All right. The final thing is dual relationships. That means that you have more than one relationship, and the problem is if it affects your judgment. When I was a direct staff, there was a lot of people I worked with who I ended up becoming friends with, quote unquote friends. Now, in and of itself, the dual relationship of being a coworker and a friend wasn't the problem. It would only become a problem that you need to consider as an ethical violation if it clouds your judgment in some way. So, for example, let's say you were friends with a colleague and you saw that your friend was, forging their timesheets so that it said that they were doing more hours than they were actually doing. But because you're friends, you didn't want to get them in trouble, and so you didn't bring this up to them as a concern. Or you didn't bring it up to the supervisor and say, I observed so-and-so do this. That's where dual relationship becomes a problem. This is why a supervisor should not date any of their direct staff, because they have a direct supervisory relationship over them. It can impair their judgment on how they respond if that direct staff needs constructive criticism. Certainly, a dual relationship with the family is a big no-no. You are the service provider, they are the service recipient, and that is the only relationship you should have with that family. You should not be their babysitter or nanny or car washer or, friend. That is not appropriate because it can cloud your judgment. So it's best as a blanket policy to avoid at all costs dual relationships. If for some reason a dual relationship begins to develop, or a dual relationship cannot be avoided because some of our staff work in very remote, kind of rural areas where the whole town knows each other, if a dual relationship is unavoidable or develops accidentally, it needs to be handled very carefully, it needs to be managed, and it needs to be managed with the utmost importance given to benefit the client. The client's benefit always needs to be coming over our benefit in the relationship. And so if you discover that a dual relationship is developing or has developed, you need to manage it with the utmost concern. The primary concern is for the client's benefit. And that's it. If you have any questions, let's please ask them now. Otherwise, I'm going to go back to the first slide and record about the first half of the first page again because I didn't have the recording going during that time. So go ahead and ask your questions on the chat if you have any. Otherwise, if you don't want to hear me repeat something I already said, you're more than welcome to sign off. I appreciate you guys spending a couple hours with me today. It ran a little longer than I anticipated, but now I know for the next one that we'll schedule a 4-hour webinar. All right, have a good Saturday, you guys. Go out there and help out some kiddos. Bye. Okay, so at the beginning of the lecture, I forgot to start the recording button, and so we missed the first half of the first page of the BCAT task list, which had to do with autism spectrum disorder. And so now I'm going to go over some of the points that I made during that part of the lecture, during that part of the webinar. I'm going to do it a little quicker. The document that was included as a handout, the Dr. Carpenter PDF, it basically gives a bunch of examples of all of the areas of deficit in kids with autism. Deficits in social, emotional reciprocity, ranging from abnormal, blah, 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 which coincides perfectly with the task list that the BCAT is using. So what I'm going to recommend is that each of you go through this handout, look at the examples that Dr. Carpenter is giving for like this A2 area, for example, to kind of familiarize yourself with what are some examples of, you know, nonverbal communicative behaviors that kids with autism have a hard time doing. And then there's a whole bunch of examples right here. Go through this entire document from this page all the way down to here. And you may even want to read this little table. It's also very handy to give you a little more idea about it. And that's really going to help you guys understand the entire first page of the BCAT task list. So I think I'm going to just end it there and let you guys do it on your own. I will make sure that this recording is available and is emailed to everyone probably Monday morning so that you guys will have it to study from. Please don't procrastinate. If you want to start studying now, by all means, go ahead and look up the Dr. Carpenter thing on Google or the National Standards Project Phase 2 on Google. But I will try to send out all of those things as well as this recording by Monday morning. Okay? Thank you. Have a good day.